Welcome, my friends, to another journey into the dark corners of history that most prefer to forget. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're joining me from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. I find it fascinating to think of all of you scattered across the globe, perhaps staying up late or starting your morning with stories of the sea's most brutal criminals. Now then, settle in close and listen well, for I'm about to tell you a tale that will turn your stomach, chill your blood, and make you grateful for every moment of your soft, civilized existence. This is the story of how I became a pirate, not by choice, mind you, but by the cruel hand of fate and the sharper edge of a cutlass. If you're expecting tales of glittering treasure and romantic adventures on the high seas, you'd best stop reading now and find yourself a book of fairy tales instead. The truth of pirate life? It's darker than the deepest ocean trench at midnight, more putrid than a week-old corpse left rotting in tropical heat, and filled with more screaming, suffering, and soul-crushing despair than the worst nightmares your mind could conjure. But you asked for it, so settle in close to the fire. Pour yourself something strong, you'll need it, and prepare to learn what it really meant to sail under the black flag in those godforsaken days when the Caribbean was a hunting ground for monsters in human form. My name is Thomas Hartwell, though I haven't used that name in decades. These days, the few who know me call me Old Tom, and I've grown comfortable with the simplicity of it. I live quietly now in a cottage by the sea, far from the shipping lanes and the memories that haunt those waters. Most days I can almost forget what I once was, what I did, and what was done to me during those blood-soaked years when I sailed with the most vicious cutthroats ever to plague the Spanish Main. But tonight, with the wind howling outside and the waves crashing against the rocks below, the memories come flooding back like a tide that cannot be held at bay. And perhaps it's time, past time, to tell someone the truth about what piracy really meant in those days when the law was whatever you could enforce with sword and pistol, and mercy was a luxury that few could afford. I was born in a small farming village in Devon, the second son of a blacksmith who barely scraped together enough coin to keep his family fed. My older brother inherited the trade and the shop. I inherited nothing but the knowledge that I'd need to make my own way in the world. At 18, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few shillings in my pocket, I made my way to Plymouth and signed aboard a merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean. The Esperanza was her name, and she was a decent enough ship with a captain who didn't beat his crew without cause, and cargo holds that weren't infested with too many rats. I thought I was beginning an adventure, seeing the world beyond the grey skies and muddy fields of my childhood. I had dreams of making my fortune in the new world, perhaps even returning home wealthy enough to buy land of my own. Such naive dreams seem laughable now, knowing what I know about the world and the creatures that inhabit it. The boy who signed aboard the Esperanza died during my first months at sea, though it took me years to realize it. He was replaced by something harder, colder, more willing to do whatever was necessary to survive another's day in a world that had no use for weakness or moral scruples. The merchant trade in those days was a risky business, made more dangerous by the constant threat of piracy. The Caribbean waters were infested with predators of every description. Desperate men who'd turned to the sea for reasons they rarely discussed, escaped slaves seeking freedom through violence, failed colonists who'd discovered that theft was easier than honest labor, and career criminals who'd found their true calling in the systematic robbery of merchant shipping. But despite the dangers, there was good money to be made in trade between the islands and the mainland colonies. sugar, tobacco, coffee, rum, manufactured goods from Europe, all of it flowing back and forth across sea lanes that were poorly patrolled by undermanned naval forces. A smart merchant could make a fortune if he was careful, lucky, and willing to take calculated risks. I served aboard the Esperanza for 2 years, learning seamanship and navigation, building the strength and skills that would later prove essential to my survival. I was good at the work, reliable in storms, handy with rope and sail, respectful to my superiors. The captain, William Morrison, took a liking to me and began teaching me navigation, hinting that I might someday earn a position as his mate if I continued to prove myself worthy. Those were perhaps the happiest years of my life, though I didn't appreciate them at the time. I was young, strong, optimistic about the future, and blissfully ignorant of the horrors that awaited just beyond the horizon. I thought I understood danger because I'd survived a few storms and learned to climb rigging in rough weather. I believed I was worldly because I'd visited ports in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Windward Islands. What a fool I was! The morning that changed everything started like any other. We were 3 days out of Port Royal, bound for Charleston with a cargo of sugar and rum, sailing through waters we'd traversed dozens of times without incident. The weather was fair, the crew was in good spirits, and I was standing watch at the bow, enjoying the salt spray and the endless expanse of blue water stretching to every horizon. That's when I saw them. At first it was just a speck on the horizon, so distant I couldn't be sure it was a ship at all. But as the minutes passed, the speck grew larger, and its intentions became unmistakably clear. This vessel was not simply crossing our path or following a similar course. It was pursuing us with the focused determination of a hunting predator. I called out to Captain Morrison, who took one look through his spyglass and immediately began shouting orders that sent the crew scrambling. We tried to run, pushing the Esperanza to her limits, but our pursuers had the advantage of a cleaner hull and more favourable winds. They gained on us steadily, inexorably, like death itself approaching on dark wings. The ship that overhauled us was a brigantine flying colours I didn't recognise. A black flag with a skull above crossed cutlasses, surrounded by symbols that looked like they'd been drawn in blood. Her hull was painted black. Her sails were patched with whatever fabric the crew had been able to scavenge, and she moved through the water with a grace that spoke of excellent maintenance despite her rough appearance. When she was close enough for us to see individual faces on her deck, they fired a warning shot across our bow. The cannonball splashed into the sea 50 yards ahead of us, sending up a geyser of spray that drenched our forward rigging. The message was clear: surrender or face the consequences. Captain Morrison was a brave man, but he was also a practical one. He'd seen what pirates did to crews who resisted, and he had no desire to watch his men die for the sake of cargo that belonged to other people anyway. He ordered our flag struck and our ship brought to a stop. The pirates came aboard like a plague of locusts, swarming over the rail with cutlasses in their teeth and pistols in their hands. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this many times before, securing our crew, searching for hidden weapons, and taking immediate inventory of our cargo. Their captain was a man I'll never forget, though I've tried for decades to erase his image from my memory. He was tall and lean, with black hair tied back in a queue, and a beard that had been waxed into points. His eyes were the colour of winter storms, cold and calculating, missing nothing as they swept over our captured vessel. But it was his smile that truly terrified me, an expression of genuine pleasure, as if our capture had made his day complete. He looked at us the way a cat might regard a cage full of mice, already anticipating the entertainment to come. "Welcome aboard the Devil's Bargain," he said in a voice that carried easily across the deck despite being barely above a conversational tone. "I am Captain Erasmus Blackwood, and you are now my guests. I trust you'll find your stay educational." What followed was a systematic robbery that took the better part of 3 hours. The pirates went through our cargo with professional thoroughness, taking not just the most valuable items but also supplies they needed: rope, sailcloth, tools, weapons, food, and anything else that might prove useful aboard their own vessel. But they didn't stop with material goods. They also evaluated the crew, looking for men with useful skills who might be worth recruiting. The ship's carpenter was given a choice: join or die. He chose to join. The cook was made the same offer and accepted with alacrity that suggested he'd been considering a career change anyway. Then Captain Blackwood turned his attention to me. "You," he said, pointing with the tip of his cutlass. "What's your trade?" "Seaman, sir," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. 2 years' experience on merchant vessels. He studied me with these cold grey eyes, taking in my build, my calloused hands, the way I stood. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "Can you climb rigging in a storm?" "Yes, sir." "Can you handle yourself in a fight?" I hesitated, which was apparently answer enough. "Well," he said with that terrible smile, "I suppose we'll find out soon enough. Welcome to the crew of the Devil's Bargain, boy. Try not to disappoint me." And just like that, my old life ended, and my new one began. The boy who'd left Devon with dreams of honest success died that morning in the Caribbean sun, replaced by someone harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous than I could have imagined possible. I was 23 when my old life ended, working the merchant routes through the Caribbean. It wasn't much of a life, truth be told, but it was mine. I hauled cargo, mended sails, and earned my bread through honest labour. The work was hard, the pay was poor, but at least I could sleep at night without worrying about having my throat slit for the coins in my pocket. That changed on a Tuesday morning when the devil himself appeared on the horizon. I remember the moment precisely. I was adjusting the rigging when our lookout's voice cracked like a whip across the deck. "Black flag to the west." My blood turned to ice water. We all knew what that meant. Pirates. The ship that bore down on us looked like it had sailed straight out of Hell's Harbour. Her hull was blackened with age and battle, her sails patched with whatever fabric the crew could steal or scavenge. But she moved through the water like a predator, sleek and deadly, cutting through the waves with a purpose that made my bowels clench with fear. Our captain, poor soul, tried to run. But you can't outrun death when it's got the wind in its sails and murder in its heart. The pirate ship closed the distance like a hawk diving on a rabbit, and when they were within cannon range, they opened fire. I'd never heard a cannon before. Not really. The sound isn't just noise, it's violence made audible. It slams into your chest, rattles your bones, and leaves your ears ringing like church bells gone mad. Splinters the size of daggers flew through the air as their first shot punched a hole in our hull. Men screamed, some in pain, others in pure terror. Our captain's voice broke as he shouted orders that no one could follow. What do you do when death comes calling with cannons and cutlasses? Where do you run when you're trapped on a wooden box in the middle of an endless ocean? They boarded us before we could surrender, though surrender wouldn't have mattered anyway. Pirates aren't known for their mercy. They came across on ropes and planks like a plague of locusts, screaming curses in a dozen languages, waving rusted blades that gleamed with dried blood. Their leader, a mountain of a man with scars mapping his face like a chart of violence, fired his pistol into the air and bellowed, "Anyone moves, everyone dies." We dropped our weapons. What choice did we have? I let my knife clatter to the deck and raised my hands like a man praying to a god who'd already turned his back. Some of the crew wept, others just stood there, stunned, waiting to see if they'd live another 5 minutes. The pirates stripped us of everything, our clothes, our coin, our dignity. They threw us the most ragged garments from their own ship and told us we were crew now. "Say goodbye to your old life," one of them laughed, shoving me toward their vessel. "You're part of the Brotherhood now, whether you like it or not." And that's how I became a pirate. Not through any choice of my own, but because the alternative was a quick trip to the bottom of the sea with my throat opened like a second mouth. The historical record shows that many pirates were recruited this way, pressed into service after their ships were taken. Captain Kidd's crew, for instance, most claimed they were forced to join rather than choosing the pirate's life. Once you were aboard, refusing to participate wasn't really an option. Saying no often meant being tossed overboard, and there were no polite resignation letters in piracy. It was a job for life, or until something sharper ended it for you. And just like that, my old life ended, and my new one began. The boy who'd left Devon with dreams of honest success died that morning in the Caribbean sun, replaced by someone harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous than I could have imagined possible. They transferred me to the Devil's Bargain along with the other conscripts, leaving Captain Morrison and the remainder of his crew aboard the Esperanza, with enough supplies to limp to the nearest friendly port. It was an act of mercy that surprised me, though I would later learn that Blackwood's reputation for occasional clemency was part of his strategy. Word would spread that surrender might mean survival, making future captures less likely to resist. The Devil's Bargain was unlike any vessel I'd ever seen. Where the Esperanza had been clean, well-maintained, and organized according to naval standards, this ship was a floating contradiction that somehow managed to be both chaotic and efficiently functional. The deck was stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The rigging was a patchwork of different ropes and materials, and the crew quarters smelled like a combination of unwashed bodies, stale alcohol, and something sweetly rotten that made my stomach clench. Yet despite the apparent disorder, everything worked. The sails were properly set, the guns were clean and ready for action, and the crew moved with the practiced coordination of men who knew their business. It was organized chaos, held together by shared desperation, and the iron will of a captain who tolerated no weakness. My first meal aboard the Devil's Bargain was an education in itself. The cook, a barrel-shaped man missing his left eye and most of his teeth, served up a stew that defied classification. It contained chunks of meat that might have been beef, fish, or something else entirely, floating in a grey broth that tasted like despair seasoned with seawater. "What's in it?" I asked the man sitting next to me, a grizzled sailor with scars crisscrossing his face like a map of violence. He looked at me with something approaching pity. "Rule number 1, boy, never ask what's in the food. Rule number 2, eat it anyway, because it's all you're getting. Rule number 3, be grateful you're getting anything at all." His name was Samuel Griggs, and he'd been aboard the Devil's Bargain for 3 years. He'd started as a pressed man like myself, captured from a Dutch trading vessel, and had gradually worked his way up to a position of relative respect among the crew. He became my unofficial mentor during those first terrifying weeks, teaching me the unwritten rules that governed life aboard a pirate ship. The key to survival, he told me that first night as we swayed in our hammocks, is to be useful but not indispensable, competent but not threatening, loyal but not stupid. Make yourself valuable enough that they want to keep you alive, but not so valuable that someone might decide to eliminate potential competition. It was a delicate balance that took months to master. Too much enthusiasm made you suspect. After all, what kind of person enjoyed piracy enough to excel at it? Too little effort marked you as deadweight that the crew couldn't afford to carry. You had to find the middle ground between collaboration and resistance, between fitting in and maintaining some vestige of your humanity. The ship's hierarchy was unlike anything I'd experienced in legitimate maritime service. While naval vessels operated according to strict rank and formal protocol, pirate ships functioned more like armed democracies, where authority was earned through competence, feared through violence, or both. The captain held ultimate power, but only as long as he retained the crew's confidence. The quartermaster served as a check on the captain's authority, representing the crew's interests in disputes and major decisions. Below these leaders, the crew was organized according to skills and experience rather than formal rank. The gunner commanded respect during battles, the navigator was crucial during long voyages, the carpenter was essential for ship maintenance, and the surgeon, such as he was, held sway during medical emergencies. Everyone else fell into the general category of crew, with status determined by length of service, fighting ability and usefulness during various operations. My position was at the very bottom of this informal hierarchy. As a newly pressed landsman with no pirate experience, I was assigned the worst duties: scrubbing decks, cleaning guns, hauling water, and performing whatever menial tasks the established crew members didn't want to do themselves. It was degrading work, but it served an important purpose. It kept me busy, demonstrated my willingness to contribute, and gradually introduced me to the ship's routines. The daily schedule aboard the Devil's Bargain was unlike anything I'd known on merchant vessels. There was no regular reveille, no formal watch changes, no structured meal times. Instead, the ship operated according to the rhythms of opportunity and necessity. When prey was spotted, everyone worked frantically to intercept it. When storms threatened, all hands laboured to secure the ship. During calm periods, maintenance was performed, weapons were cleaned, and the crew rested or entertained themselves as best they could. This regular schedule took considerable adjustment. My body, accustomed to the predictable routines of legitimate seamanship, struggled to adapt to the feast or famine pace of pirate life. Some days we worked 18 hours straight, chasing distant sails or battling through rough weather. Other days we lounged about like passengers, with nothing more demanding than card games and storytelling to occupy our time. The uncertainty was almost worse than the hard work. Never knowing when the next crisis would erupt, when violence might explode without warning, when the captain might decide that someone needed to be made an example of. This constant tension wore on the nerves in ways that steady labour never could, but gradually I began to adapt. My hands toughened from handling rough rope and salt-crusted rigging. My stomach adjusted to the irregular meals and questionable food quality. My ears grew accustomed to the constant profanity and casual discussions of violence that formed the soundtrack of daily conversation. More troubling was the way my moral sensibilities began to erode. The first time I watched pirates torture a prisoner for information about hidden cargo, I was physically sick. The second time, I looked away but stayed nearby. By the fourth or fifth incident, I found myself observing with detached interest, analysing the interrogator's technique rather than feeling sympathy for the victim. This gradual hardening of conscience was both necessary for survival and deeply disturbing to whatever remained of my original character. Each small compromise, each moment when I chose safety over righteousness, each time I participated in activities I would have condemned just months earlier, all of it accumulated into a fundamental change in who I was as a human being. The crew of the Devil's Bargain was a fascinating study in human adaptation to extreme circumstances. These men came from dozens of different backgrounds: former naval sailors who'd deserted or been dismissed, escaped slaves seeking freedom through violence, failed colonists who'd turned to piracy when legitimate opportunities disappeared, career criminals who'd discovered their true calling on the high seas. What united them wasn't nationality, religion, or social class. It was shared desperation and the bonds forged through mutual dependence in the face of constant danger. They might argue, fight, even kill each other during quiet periods, but when external threats appeared, they functioned as a coordinated unit with efficiency that would have impressed any military commander. Among the crew were characters I'll never forget, each representing a different path that led to piracy. There was Portuguese Manuel, who'd been a successful merchant in Lisbon until political upheaval destroyed his business and forced him to flee with nothing but his knowledge of trade routes and hidden harbours. He served as the ship's unofficial diplomat, negotiating with port officials and fence operations that helped dispose of stolen goods. Mad. Mickey O'Brien had been a ship's carpenter in the Royal Navy until a dispute with an officer led to a court-martial and a sentence of 500 lashes. He'd escaped during a port call and eventually found his way to piracy, where his skills made him invaluable, and his grudge against legitimate authority made him a natural fit for the lifestyle. Kwame, whose original name had been lost or deliberately discarded, was an escaped slave who'd killed his master's family before fleeing to the Caribbean. He spoke little English but was fluent in violence, serving as one of the ship's most effective fighters and boarding party members. These men and dozens like them formed a community of outcasts who'd found belonging among other outcasts. They shared a contempt for the established order that had failed or betrayed them, a willingness to take by force what the world had denied them through legal means, and a pragmatic understanding that their survival depended on their ability to function as a team despite their individual differences. The ship itself became a character in this drama, creaking and groaning with its own personality. The Devil's Bargain had originally been a Royal Navy frigate captured during a daring raid on Port Royal. The pirates had modified her extensively, removing unnecessary decorations, reinforcing the gun deck, and optimizing her for speed and maneuverability rather than durability. She was fast, responsive, and deadly, capable of overtaking most merchant vessels and outrunning many naval ships. But she was also temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and skilled handling to achieve her full potential. The crew treated her with the mixture of affection and wariness typically reserved for dangerous but useful animals. Living aboard her was like inhabiting a wooden world that existed between sea and sky, isolated from normal human society by miles of empty ocean. We developed our own customs, our own language, our own standards of behaviour that would have seemed alien to anyone from the civilized world we'd left behind. Time moved differently on the Devil's Bargain. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, until the calendar became meaningless, and we measured time by storms survived, ships captured, and crew members lost. The outside world, with its laws, its moral certainties, its predictable routines, gradually faded into memory until it seemed like something from a half-remembered dream. This isolation bred a unique form of madness, a kind of collective delusion that what we were doing was not just necessary, but somehow justified by the circumstances that had driven us to it. We told ourselves stories about the corruption of legitimate authority, the hypocrisy of legal commerce built on slavery and exploitation, the right of desperate men to take what they needed for survival. Some of these stories contained grains of truth, but they were primarily mechanisms for avoiding the uncomfortable reality that we had become predators feeding on the misery of others. The mental gymnastics required to maintain this self-deception were exhausting, but the alternative, acknowledging what we'd truly become, was too painful for most men to bear, and so we continued day after day, month after month, caught in a cycle of violence and self-justification that grew harder to escape with each passing season. The boy who'd signed aboard the Esperanza with dreams of honest prosperity was gone forever, replaced by someone I barely recognized but had no choice but to inhabit. My first night aboard was pure misery. The ship rocked like a drunk trying to walk a straight line, and I spent most of it hanging over the side, emptying my stomach into the waves. The sleeping quarters were below deck in a space that smelled like mouldy bread, unwashed bodies, and something else I couldn't identify but hoped wasn't what I thought it was. I tried to find the kitchen to get something to settle my stomach, but there wasn't one. Just a man they called Cookie who boiled random animal parts into something that looked like defeat and smelled worse. When I asked what was in the stew, he just grinned with his 3 remaining teeth and said, "Best not to know, lad. Best not to know." That first night, lying on a damp board that passed for a bed, listening to someone nearby snore so loudly I thought they might be dying, I realized the truth that would haunt the rest of my days at sea. This wasn't an adventure. This was a trap, and I was caught in it like a rat in a maze with no exit. The pirate ship operated under its own twisted set of rules. Once you were officially part of the crew, you were expected to pull your weight or face the consequences. I watched them tie one complainer to the mast and whip him until his back looked like raw meat. After that, I kept my mouth shut and my head down. But here's the strange part that I never expected. Despite all the violence and chaos, there was a bizarre sense of fairness among the crew. They had something called the Articles of Agreement, a kind of pirate constitution. Everyone got a share of the plunder. Decisions were made democratically. Even the captain could be voted out if the crew lost confidence in him. It was like the worst job in the world combined with the most progressive workplace policies you could imagine. Except your co-workers solved disputes with daggers and considered personal hygiene optional. The share they promised me came with a catch, though. I wouldn't get anything until the next successful raid, and nobody was promising when that would be. For now, I was just another body helping to keep the ship afloat while we limped through waters that seemed determined to kill us all. Those waters were full of things that wanted us dead. Hurricanes that could snap masts like twigs, naval ships hunting pirates for the bounty on their heads, other pirates who might decide our cargo was worth more than our lives. Even our own ship seemed to be falling apart beneath our feet, creaking and groaning like an old man climbing stairs. There was a saying aboard ship: "The sea takes what it wants." The man who taught it to me was missing 2 fingers and had a tooth that whistled when he talked. When I asked what happened to his fingers, he just said, "Bad captain," and walked away. That was lesson number 1 in pirate philosophy. Don't ask too many questions. The first raid I participated in was a disaster that nearly cost me my life. and taught me more about the reality of piracy than all the stories and warnings I'd ever heard. We'd been cruising the shipping lanes for 2 weeks without encountering anything more promising than a few fishing boats when the lookout spotted sails on the horizon. Through Captain Blackwood's spyglass, the distant vessel appeared to be a Spanish merchant galleon, heavily laden and moving slowly through the swells, exactly the kind of prize that could make the entire crew wealthy beyond their dreams. What we didn't know was that the Spanish had grown tired of losing ships to pirates and had begun using heavily armed vessels disguised as vulnerable merchant craft. The galleon we approached so confidently was actually a warship in disguise, carrying enough firepower to sink us and experienced naval gunners eager to demonstrate their skills. The deception was nearly perfect. As we closed the distance, the supposed merchant vessel maintained the appearance of helpless vulnerability, even going so far as to fly distress signals suggesting engine problems. It wasn't until we were well within cannon range that the trap was sprung. Gun ports opened along the enemy's hull like hungry mouths, revealing a double row of cannon that had been cleverly concealed behind false planking. Before we could react, the Spanish ship opened fire with a coordinated broadside that sent iron balls screaming across the water toward our unprotected hull. The sound was indescribable. Not just the roar of cannon fire, but the whistle of shot passing overhead, the crash of splintering wood, and the screams of men caught in the deadly rain of metal and debris. I threw myself flat on the deck as a cannonball punched through the rail not 5 feet from where I'd been standing, sending wooden splinters flying like daggers. Captain Blackwood's response was immediate and decisive. Rather than trying to flee, which would have exposed our stern to devastating raking fire, he ordered us to close the distance and attempt to board the enemy vessel. It was a desperate gamble, but our only chance of survival lay in getting close enough that their guns couldn't depress sufficiently to target us. The next 20 minutes were pure chaos. Both ships maneuvered for advantage while trading devastating broadsides at point-blank range. The Devil's Bargain shuddered with each impact, her timbers groaning under the assault. Men fell around me, some killed outright, others screaming from wounds that would prove fatal if we lived long enough for them to matter. I found myself assigned to a gun crew, helping to load and aim one of our 12-pounders, while shot flew overhead and splinters rained down like deadly snow. The work was back-breaking and terrifying, hauling the massive gun back into position after each firing, swabbing out the barrel, ramming home powder and shot, then heaving the weapon forward again for the next discharge. The heat was incredible. Gunpowder smoke filled the air until breathing became an exercise in controlled suffocation. The noise was so overwhelming that communication was impossible, except through gestures and direct contact. Blood made the deck slippery underfoot, and the smell of it mixed with burning powder and splintered wood created an assault on the senses that threatened to overwhelm completely. When we finally managed to close the distance and launch our boarding attempt, I found myself swept along with the assault party whether I wanted to participate or not. Grappling hooks flew across the narrow gap between ships, securing lines that allowed the more experienced pirates to swing aboard the enemy vessel with cutlasses in their teeth and pistols in their hands. I followed more clumsily, half falling onto the Spanish deck and immediately finding myself face to face with the uniformed officer who was attempting to rally his men for a counterattack. He saw me coming and raised his sword, but my desperation gave me an advantage that skill might not have provided. We grappled for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, rolling across the deck while trying to gain control of his weapon. He was stronger and more experienced, but I was fighting for my life with the desperate energy of someone who knew that failure meant death. When his grip loosened for just an instant, I managed to drive my knife between his ribs and into his heart. He died with a look of surprise on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe that a common pirate had bested an officer of the Spanish Navy. I stared down at his lifeless body, overwhelmed by the realization that I had just killed another human being, not in self-defense during a boarding action, but in deliberate combat where I'd actively sought his death. The fighting continued around me, but I was temporarily paralyzed by the magnitude of what I'd done. This wasn't an accident or a moment of panic. It was murder, pure and simple, committed for the sake of stolen cargo that I didn't even particularly want. The boy from Devon who dreamed of honest success would have been horrified by what I'd become in just a few short months, but there was no time for philosophical reflection. The battle was still raging, and standing still on a hostile deck was an excellent way to end up dead. I picked up the dead officer's sword, a much better weapon than my sailor's knife, and rejoined the fighting with whatever remained of my conscience firmly locked away. The Spanish fought with professional discipline and obvious courage, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard by the ferocity of our assault. Pirates fought differently than naval personnel, with less formal technique but more savage determination, willing to take risks that trained sailors would consider suicidal. When the enemy captain fell with a pistol ball through his skull, their resistance collapsed quickly. The surviving crew members threw down their weapons and begged for quarter, which Captain Blackwood granted with surprising magnanimity. Dead men couldn't provide information about other ships or hidden cargo, and reputation for occasional mercy made future captures more likely to surrender without costly fights. The victory celebration was muted by our casualties. We'd lost 8 men dead and another dozen wounded, several seriously enough that their survival was questionable. The ship had taken significant damage that would require extensive repairs before we could safely engage another enemy. Most sobering of all was the realization that we'd been extraordinarily lucky. A few different tactical decisions by the Spanish captain could have resulted in our complete destruction, but we had won, and with victory came the spoils that made all the risk and suffering seem worthwhile. The captured ship's hold contained not just the cargo manifest suggested, sugar, tobacco, and manufactured goods, but also a substantial quantity of silver coins intended to pay Spanish colonial officials. It was more wealth than most of the crew had ever seen in one place, enough to make every man aboard significantly richer. The division of spoils followed the traditional pirate code with mathematical precision. Captain Blackwood received 2 shares. The quartermaster and other officers received 1.5 shares each, and common crew members like myself received single shares. My portion came to nearly 50 silver pieces, more money than I'd earned during 2 years of legitimate merchant service, but the money felt different from wages I'd earned through honest labour. These coins were stained with blood, not metaphorically but literally, since several had been in the pocket of the officer I'd killed. Holding them in my hands, I could smell the metallic scent of violence and feel the weight of lives that had been lost to acquire them. Some of the crew celebrated with the enthusiasm of men who'd just escaped death and been rewarded for their survival. They drank, sang, and boasted about their performance during the battle, already transforming the terrifying reality of combat into heroic stories that would grow more dramatic with each retelling. Others, like myself, sat quietly and tried to process what we'd experienced. The transition from merchant sailor to pirate warrior wasn't something that happened overnight, and the psychological adjustment was often more difficult than the physical challenges. Samuel Griggs found me that evening, sitting alone near the bow and staring out at the darkening sea. He settled beside me without speaking for several minutes, apparently understanding that some experiences required time and silence before they could be discussed. "First time killing a man?" he finally asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Gets easier," he said, though his tone suggested that wasn't necessarily a good thing. "The first one stays with you forever, but the others, they start to blur together after a while. Names become faces, faces become numbers, numbers become nothing at all." He was right, though I wouldn't fully understand his words until years later when I'd accumulated enough corpses to fill a small cemetery. The Spanish officer whose life I'd taken that day remained vivid in my memory, long after I'd forgotten the faces of dozens of other men I'd killed. He became a symbol of my transformation from legitimate sailor to pirate killer, marking the moment when whatever remained of my original moral character finally died. But that was still in the future. For now I was simply a young man trying to come to terms with the fact that I'd just crossed a line from which there could be no return. The money in my pocket felt heavier than lead, and the sword at my side seemed to whisper promises of future violence that both terrified and tempted me. The Devil's Bargain limped toward a hidden cove where we could effect repairs and dispose of our captured goods. The wounded moaned in the makeshift sick bay. The dead had been sewn into canvas shrouds and committed to the deep, and the ship herself bore the scars of battle in her splintered rails and patched sails. It should have been a moment of triumph, a successful action that had enriched every survivor and demonstrated our effectiveness as a fighting force. Instead, it felt like a funeral for whatever innocence I'd managed to retain during my first months of piracy. The boy who'd been pressed into service against his will was finally completely dead. In his place stood someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more capable of the violence that pirate life demanded. I didn't like this new version of myself, but I was beginning to understand that liking and survival were two very different things in the world I now inhabited. As we sailed toward our refuge under a canopy of stars that seemed unusually cold and distant, I made a silent promise to the memory of the man I'd killed. I would remember him, honour his sacrifice by acknowledging what his death had cost both of us, and never allow myself to forget the price of the life I'd chosen. It was a promise I would keep for the next 20 years, through dozens of battles and hundreds of victims, until the weight of accumulated guilt became too heavy to bear, and I finally found the courage to walk away from the sea that had claimed so much of my soul. But that was still years in the future. For now I was just a newly minted pirate coming to terms with the reality that there was no going back to the life I'd lost. But that was still years in the future. For now I was just a newly minted pirate coming to terms with the reality that there was no going back to the life I'd lost. The Devil's Bargain carried me toward whatever fate awaited, and I could only hope that somewhere in the darkness ahead I might find a way to reclaim at least a portion of my humanity. The hidden cove where we made our repairs was like something from a fever dream. A narrow inlet surrounded by towering cliffs draped with tropical vegetation, invisible from the open sea and accessible only to those who knew exactly where to look. It had obviously been used by pirates for years, perhaps decades. The beach was littered with the remains of previous careening operations, broken barrels, discarded tools, the bleached bones of ships that had died in these waters. A small settlement had grown up around the natural harbour, ramshackle buildings constructed from shipwreck timber and roofed with salvaged sailcloth. The inhabitants were a mix of retired pirates, escaped slaves, indigenous people, and various other refugees from civilization who'd found sanctuary in this lawless refuge. The settlement's unofficial leader was a woman called Black Sarah, though whether this referred to her complexion or her disposition was never made clear to me. She'd apparently been a pirate captain herself, before an injury during a boarding action left her with a permanent limp and a decision to pursue less physically demanding forms of crime. Now she served as a fence for stolen goods, a source of supplies and information, and a neutral arbitrator for disputes between different pirate crews. Her word was law in the cove, enforced by a collection of heavily armed followers who'd chosen steady employment over the uncertainties of active piracy. During our 2-week stay, I had my first opportunity to observe pirate society when it wasn't constrained by the limited space and resources of a ship at sea. What I saw was both fascinating and horrifying. A community held together by shared criminality, but constantly threatened by the same violence that defined its existence. The settlement operated according to a rough democracy, where disputes were settled by combat, negotiation, or the intervention of Black Sarah and her enforcers. There were no formal laws, but there were understood boundaries. Theft from fellow pirates was punishable by death. Violence against women was not tolerated, and anyone who brought unwanted attention from naval forces would be dealt with permanently. Within these broad parameters, almost anything was permissible. Gambling, prostitution, public drunkenness, and recreational violence were not just tolerated but actively encouraged. The settlement's taverns, crude structures that served rum, beer, and substances I couldn't identify, operated around the clock, filled with men and women celebrating their temporary freedom from the sea's dangers. I spent most of my shore leave in a daze, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of too much noise, too many people, and too many new experiences compressed into too short a time. After months of shipboard discipline and routine, the chaotic liberty of the pirate settlement was almost more disturbing than combat, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time since my capture, I could walk more than 50 feet in any direction without running into a wall or falling off the edge of my world. I could eat food that hadn't been prepared weeks in advance and stored in barrels. I could sleep in a bed that didn't sway with the motion of waves. More importantly, I could listen to stories told by pirates who'd been active for years or even decades, learning from their experiences and beginning to understand the broader context of the life I'd been forced to enter. These weren't the romanticized tales that would later appear in popular literature. They were brutal, honest accounts of survival in a world that offered no mercy to the weak or unlucky. One storyteller who particularly impressed me was a man called Compass Jack, so named for his uncanny ability to navigate by dead reckoning, even when weather made celestial observation impossible. He'd sailed with some of the most famous pirate captains of the era and had accumulated enough wealth to retire comfortably, but kept returning to active piracy because, as he put it, the sea gets in your blood and won't let go. Jack told stories about legendary pirates like Henry Morgan, who'd sacked Panama City, and Captain Kidd, whose career had ended on the gallows in London. But he also shared more practical wisdom about survival tactics, weather prediction, and the political currents that determined where naval patrols were likely to appear. The secret to longevity in this business, he told a group of us one evening as we shared a bottle of exceptional rum around a driftwood fire, is knowing when to fight and when to run, when to be generous and when to be ruthless, when to trust and when to suspect. Most pirates die because they get one of those calculations wrong at a critical moment. He'd survived 17 years of active piracy through a combination of skill, luck, and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it became deadly. His advice was worth more than gold to someone like me, still learning the fundamental skills necessary for survival in this brutal profession. Through conversations with Jack and others, I began to understand that piracy was more than simple theft. It was a complex ecosystem that depended on political instability, economic opportunity, and geographic advantages that made certain regions ideal for criminal enterprise. The Caribbean in particular offered perfect conditions. Numerous islands providing hiding places, busy shipping lanes full of valuable targets, and colonial governments too weak or corrupt to provide effective law enforcement. But this golden age of piracy was already showing signs of decline. Naval forces were becoming more professional and better equipped. Colonial governments were offering substantial bounties for pirate captures. Most significantly, the economic conditions that had driven so many men to piracy were slowly improving as legitimate opportunities for advancement expanded. "Enjoy it while it lasts, boy," Jack warned me during one of our conversations. "This life won't be possible much longer. The world's changing, and there's no place in it for men like us. We're dinosaurs, living relics of a simpler time when a man with a fast ship and a strong sword arm could make his own rules." His words proved prophetic, though it would be years before I fully understood their implications. For now, I was simply grateful for any wisdom that might help me survive the immediate challenges of pirate life. The repairs to the Devil's Bargain took longer than expected, partly because of the extensive damage we'd sustained and partly because several crew members were reluctant to leave the comforts of shore life. Captain Blackwood dealt with this insubordination in characteristically direct fashion. Anyone not aboard by the designated departure time would be left behind permanently. This wasn't an idle threat. I witnessed him abandon 3 men who'd apparently decided that a life of drunken debauchery in the settlement was preferable to the risks of continued piracy. He simply sailed away without them, as if they'd never existed. It was a brutal lesson in the absolute nature of shipboard authority and the price of challenging the captain's will. When we finally departed the cove, I was surprised to discover that I was actually relieved to be back at sea. The settlement had been an interesting experience, but it had also been exhausting and somewhat frightening. The constant noise, the unpredictable violence, the sense that anything could happen at any moment. All of it had kept me in a state of nervous tension that was more draining than physical labour. The ship, by contrast, offered structure and purpose. There were specific duties to perform, clear hierarchies to respect, and predictable routines that provided a sense of security even in the midst of danger. I was beginning to understand why some men became addicted to the pirate life despite its obvious hazards. There was something seductive about the combination of freedom and belonging that it offered. Our next target was a Dutch merchant convoy that intelligence sources suggested would be passing through our hunting grounds within the week. The plan was more sophisticated than our previous operations, involving coordination with 2 other pirate vessels and careful timing to catch the convoy at a point where naval escort would be minimal. The alliance with other pirate crews was my first exposure to the broader political dimensions of Caribbean piracy. These weren't random criminals operating in isolation. They were part of a loose but effective network that shared information, coordinated operations, and occasionally combined forces against particularly valuable or well-defended targets. The politics involved were remarkably complex. Different captains had different reputations, areas of expertise, and territorial claims that had to be respected to avoid conflicts that might prove more costly than any potential prizes. Negotiations over target selection, operational responsibilities, and profit sharing could take days and involve diplomatic skills that would have impressed professional ambassadors. Captain Blackwood was clearly respected within this community, though whether this was due to his tactical brilliance, his reputation for ruthless efficiency, or simple fear was never entirely clear to me. When he spoke during planning sessions, other captains listened carefully and rarely challenged his recommendations directly. The convoy operation was scheduled to begin at dawn 3 days hence, which gave us time to prepare both materially and psychologically. Weapons were sharpened and checked, ammunition was distributed, and the ship was organized for combat with an efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. But there was also a ritual element to these preparations that had nothing to do with practical concerns. Men made their peace with gods they'd neglected for months, wrote letters to family members they might never see again, and engaged in the superstitious behaviors that helped them believe they could influence their chances of survival. Some crew members had elaborate pre-battle routines involving specific foods, particular clothing, or prayers to patron saints who specialized in protecting criminals. Others adopted fatalistic attitudes, declaring that their fate was already written and that preparation was therefore meaningless. I found myself somewhere between these extremes, taking reasonable precautions while trying not to think too deeply about the possibilities for disaster that seemed to multiply the more I considered them. The upcoming battle would be my second major engagement, and I was acutely aware that survival in one fight guaranteed nothing about the outcome of the next. The night before the operation, Samuel Griggs sought me out for a conversation that I sensed had been building for some time. We walked to a quiet part of the ship where we were unlikely to be overheard, and he began speaking in the careful, measured tones of someone sharing important information. "You're changing, boy," he said without preamble. "I can see it in your eyes, in the way you carry yourself, in how you handle that sword you took from the Spanish officer. You're becoming one of us, whether you want to or not." I started to protest, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not saying it's good or bad," he continued. "It just is. This life changes everyone who stays with it long enough. The question is whether you can control the change or whether it controls you." He told me about his own transformation from merchant sailor to pirate, a process that had taken several years and cost him most of his connections to legitimate society. He'd had a wife and children in Amsterdam, a respectable position as a ship's officer, and prospects for advancement within the Dutch merchant marine. All of that had been destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment, a decision to join a mutiny against a captain who'd been systematically cheating his crew of their wages. The mutiny had succeeded, but the political aftermath had made it impossible for any of the participants to find legitimate employment. Piracy had been the only alternative to starvation or imprisonment. "The hardest part," he said, "isn't the fighting or the danger or even the killing. It's losing the person you used to be and trying to figure out who you're becoming. Some men go mad from it. Others become monsters. A few lucky ones find a way to stay human despite everything." His words resonated with concerns I'd been trying to ignore for months. I could feel myself changing in ways that would have horrified the boy who'd left Devon with dreams of honest success. The casual acceptance of violence, the growing comfort with theft and intimidation, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries I'd once considered absolute. All of it was happening so gradually that I could pretend it wasn't happening at all. But Griggs was right. The transformation was accelerating, and soon I would have to decide whether to embrace it fully or find some way to resist the corruption that seemed inherent in the pirate life. That decision, however, would have to wait until after the convoy operation. Tomorrow would bring new violence, new tests of survival, and new opportunities to discover just how far I was willing to go in service of my own continued existence. As I lay in my hammock that night, listening to the familiar sounds of a ship at anchor, creaking timbers, lapping waves, the snores and muttered dreams of my fellow pirates, I tried to imagine what the boy from Devon would think of the man I was becoming. The answer, I suspected, would not be flattering. But that boy was dead, killed as surely as the Spanish officer whose sword now hung at my side. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely more capable of survival in a world that offered no rewards for innocence or mercy. Tomorrow would test whether that transformation had progressed far enough to keep me alive through another day of violence and chaos. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that whatever dreams came would be haunted by the ghosts of the men I'd killed and the remnants of the person I'd once been. The ship rocked constantly, and my legs never quite adjusted to the motion. I'd stumble into walls, trip over ropes, and at least once a day, I'd swear the deck was moving just to spite me. Which, of course, it was. A few days into this floating nightmare, the reality hit me like a cannonball to the chest. I was never going home. Not really. Not to my village, my family, my bed with an actual mattress. That life was gone, as distant as the stars. The pirate ship was my world now, and everything I'd once known felt like a half-remembered dream. I missed the strangest things about land. Walking in a straight line without swaying, grass under my feet, birds that didn't screech like demons, the taste of fresh bread, even the sound of church bells in the distance. Things I'd never appreciated when I had them now haunted my memory like ghosts. Privacy was a forgotten luxury. We were packed together below deck like cargo, breathing the same stale air, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on boards or hammocks that reeked of mildew. Conversations never stopped. Arguments, groans, muttered threats, and the kind of snoring that sounded like dying animals. The air itself was a weapon, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, old cheese, wet dog, and human waste. I tried to make friends, or at least avoid making enemies. There was Peggy Joe, who'd lost his eye in what he claimed was a duel with a Spanish assassin, though others said it was really a bar fight over a woman with questionable morals. There was Knuckles, a giant of a man who collected other people's teeth for reasons I didn't want to understand. And there was Whisper, who never spoke but was always smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. Mealtimes were exercises in survival. The ship's stores included salted meat that was more bone than flesh, hardtack biscuits with insects baked right in, and something that might have been pickled cabbage before it died and went to hell. There was rum, lots of rum, not for celebration, but for numbing the pain of existence. I learned quickly that everyone drank not for pleasure, but for survival. The rations were so foul that the rats looked healthier than most of the crew. Fresh water was rationed like liquid gold and tasted like rust and regret. As for washing, don't make me laugh. We were lucky if we got caught in a rainstorm and could fight 10 other men for a chance to get clean. My clothes hadn't been dry since I'd been forced aboard, and my socks had become biological hazards that I was afraid to remove. This was the glamorous life of a seaborne outlaw, and it was only the beginning. Here's something that might surprise you. Pirates actually had some of the strictest supply management codes you could imagine. Despite their reputations as lawless savages, most crews kept careful inventory and were absolutely vicious about rationing. Waste water and you'd be flogged. Steal food and you'd face execution. On some ships they'd maroon you, leave you on a deserted island with a pistol and a single shot, just in case starvation got too boring. This wasn't a floating party where rum and roasted pig flowed freely. It was more like the world's most dysfunctional military unit, run by angry drunks with weapons and serious authority issues. The chores never ended. Everyone had to pull their weight, and that meant scrubbing decks with sand and seawater, patching sails while balanced on swaying masts that seemed designed to throw you into the ocean, and, worst of all, cleaning out the bilge. The bilge was the lowest part of the ship where all the liquid waste settled. Imagine the most disgusting place you've ever seen, then multiply that by 1,000 and add the smell of rotting despair. I spent hours down there in knee-deep muck, scooping out sludge while trying not to think about what I was scooping. One man working beside me swore he saw a crab with 3 eyes. I didn't know whether to believe him or just cry. Despite all this misery, I began to understand something strange about life aboard the ship. It was its own world, a terrible one, but still a functioning system. Everyone had a job, a rank, a place in hierarchy. The captain gave orders and got the best food. The quartermaster handled disputes and distributed punishment. The rest of us followed orders and tried not to die. There was a rhythm to it. A dark, sweaty rhythm that gradually worked its way into my bones. But the loneliness was the worst part. Time moved strangely at sea. Days blended into nights, and I sometimes forgot what month it was. There was no calendar, no routine beyond the endless cycle of work and sleep. I started counting stars at night, giving them names in my head. Sometimes I'd talk to the sea just to hear my own voice. If the sea ever talked back, I told myself it was just sleep deprivation and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Scholars still debate whether pirates truly felt the freedom that modern stories attribute to them. Some claim the open ocean offered liberty unlike anything available on land. No kings, no taxes, no rules but their own. Others point out that being hunted by every navy in the world while trapped on a disease-ridden vessel with sociopaths isn't exactly liberating. For someone like me, pressed into service against my will, freedom felt exactly like imprisonment, just with more screaming and fewer walls. Many pirates actually missed life on land, not for family or peace, but for the simple luxury of being bored. At sea, you were either terrified, exhausted, or in pain, sometimes all three at once. I started to dream about boredom, about having a day with nothing to do but sit in one place without the ground moving beneath me. That would have felt like paradise. As night fell and I curled up on my plank of misery, trying not to touch the man drooling beside me, I found myself whispering the same prayer over and over. Please don't sink. Because if this ship went down, I wouldn't last 5 minutes in the water. And honestly, that might have been a mercy. By my 3rd week aboard this floating hell, assuming I hadn't been stabbed, thrown overboard, or crushed by a falling mast, I discovered something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The worst part of pirate life wasn't the violence or the constant threat of death. It was the food. My body had begun to rebel in ways I didn't know were possible. My stomach growled constantly, not from hunger exactly, but from whatever mysterious substances I'd been forcing down my throat. Every meal was like playing dice with death, and death had loaded the dice. We'd line up with our bowls, hoping for something remotely edible. What we got instead was a ladle full of brown-grey mush with the consistency of wet ash, and a smell that could knock a horse unconscious. Nobody asked what was in it. Asking questions was a fast way to be told to lick barnacles for dinner instead. I'd spoon the stuff into my mouth and concentrate on not gagging. It was salty, sour and chewy in ways that suggested it had once been alive and was now seeking revenge. Sometimes I'd bite down on something crunchy and learn not to investigate too closely. That path led to madness. Then there was the hardtack, the official bread of pirates and a joke played by the devil himself. These flour and water bricks had been in barrels so long they'd fossilized. I tried to bite one and nearly shattered a tooth. Eventually I learned the trick. Soak it in water or rum until it surrendered, then suck on it like a stone until it became something approaching food. But even soaked hardtack came with surprises. Maggots. Little white ones, writhing inside the biscuit like it was their personal paradise. Some men picked them out meticulously. Most didn't bother. As Knuckles put it, "Protein's protein, lad. Fresh food was a fantasy from another life. Any fruits or vegetables had rotted weeks ago. Meat was salted into something resembling leather jerky and stored in barrels that smelled worse than the bilge. Water was rationed so carefully that suggesting we use it for washing would have gotten me thrown overboard. Instead, we drank beer or watered-down rum, which meant everyone was constantly buzzed, perpetually dehydrated, and slowly developing scurvy. I didn't know what scurvy was yet. I just knew my teeth felt loose, and my gums had started bleeding. Our cook, Blacktooth, seemed to take personal pride in making everything taste like regret. He was missing most of his teeth, especially the ones needed for proper chewing, and he used a knife that looked like it had been forged at the fires of hell. He seasoned everything with ship spice, which I suspected was just ground-up rope mixed with sea salt. He'd grunt if you asked for seconds and throw a ladle at your head if you dared criticize his cooking. It was probably the most stable relationship on the ship. Pirates throughout history had serious nutritional problems. Their diet lacked vitamins, especially vitamin C, making scurvy practically a rite of passage. Sailors' gums would swell and bleed, teeth would fall out, joints would ache, and wounds would refuse to heal. In advanced cases, the flesh on their legs would blacken and rot. Many crews didn't even understand what caused it. Some blamed sea air. Others thought it was divine punishment. I just knew something was wrong when my teeth started feeling strange, and my gums began to itch constantly. The alcohol situation was its own special horror. Grog, a mixture of water, rum, and citrus if you were incredibly lucky, spoiler, we weren't, served more as bacterial warfare against contaminated water than actual refreshment. It did kill the bacteria, but it also ensured everyone was slightly drunk all the time. This made routine tasks like climbing rigging in high winds particularly entertaining. I watched men fall from the mast more than once, and not always because of the weather. I started craving impossible things. Fresh apples, bread that didn't fight back, cheese. Dear God, what I wouldn't have given for a simple wedge of cheese. I dreamed about these foods with the intensity most men reserve for thoughts of women or gold. One night, I heard a fellow crew member talking in his sleep about buttered toast. I actually wept listening to him. Butter? Did such a thing still exist in the world? Or was it just a beautiful lie we told ourselves? Food disputes weren't playful affairs. They were desperate struggles for survival. When someone was caught hoarding dried fruit, he was locked in the brig for a week. I didn't even know the ship had a brig until then. It turned out to be basically a leaky closet where even the rats looked depressed. The man emerged thin, twitchy, and missing half an eyebrow. Nobody talked about what had happened, but everyone started eyeing the food barrels with new suspicion. There was a psychological shift that happened after enough terrible meals. Food stopped being pleasure and became pure fuel, a grim necessity you consumed without joy or expectation. I'd eat mechanically, like someone clocking in for a job they hated, calculating only whether each bite would make me sick or keep me alive another day. Here's a disturbing historical fact. Some pirates believed eating rats could prevent scurvy. Rats, after all, ate everything, including spoiled fruit that still contained traces of vitamin C. So, yes, technically, eating a rat might have been healthy. There are stories of crews chasing rats around the hold like it was sport, turning vermin into delicacies during desperate voyages. I hadn't seen anyone eat a rat yet, but I definitely noticed some of the crew watching them with a calculating hunger that made me uncomfortable. The cooking methods were as medieval as the ingredients. There was no proper stove, just a firebox set on bricks in the galley, and that was only when conditions were calm enough to risk open flame. During storms, we'd survive on cold hardtack and sour beer. On good days, we might get boiled fish, though finding fish that didn't taste like concentrated misery was its own challenge. Historians still debate how much pirates actually suffered from malnutrition compared to exaggerated sailor tales. Some accounts describe thriving crews of healthy, bronze-skinned rogues feasting on fresh seafood. Others paint pictures of skeletal wrecks with bloated limbs and sunken eyes. The truth probably fell somewhere in the middle, though at the time I was definitely leaning toward the skeletal wreck category. Ironically, despite all this suffering, pirates generally ate better than Navy sailors. Royal Navy ships rationed even more strictly and dished out harsher punishments. On a pirate ship you might starve, but at least you could complain about it without being flogged. That night, lying in the dark with my stomach performing acrobatics, I tried to remember what a pear tasted like. Was it sweet? Juicy? Had such things ever really existed? Or were they just beautiful dreams we invented to torture ourselves? Someone nearby farted in their sleep. Another crew member groaned in his dreams. I thought about rats, tried not to think about rats, and whispered my nightly prayer into the darkness. Please don't sink. Little did I know that food would become the least of my problems, because in a few days I'd discover what real suffering looked like when my tooth started throbbing like a drumbeat of agony, and I'd meet the ship's surgeon, a man they called Gristle, who believed the solution to most medical problems involved rusty tools and a generous helping of rum. But that's a story for another dark night, and I need a drink before I can tell it properly. At first I thought the worst part of this floating nightmare would be the food, or perhaps the constant threat of death by cannonball. How wrong I was, how horribly, deeply wrong. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for the moment when your gums start bleeding. Your breath begins to smell like an open grave, and the left side of your jaw starts pulsing like it's telegraphing the message, "Kill me now," in Morse code. I had a toothache, and out there, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by men who considered soap a luxury and dental hygiene a myth, a toothache wasn't just pain. It was a death sentence with a smile. There were no dentists on a pirate ship, no sterile instruments, no reclining chairs with cheerful little bibs. What we had was a man named Gristle, who'd once helped extract a nail from someone's skull during a storm using nothing but a rusty hook and a bottle of rum. This qualified him as our ship's surgeon. Lucky me. Gristle didn't bother with diagnosis or examination. He took one look at my swollen face, muttered, "Rots deep," and began heating a pair of iron tongs over a candle. When I tried to back away, he grabbed me by the collar and shoved me down onto a barrel. "Sit still, boy," he growled, pressing a stick between my teeth. "This'll only hurt like the fires of hell." The crew gathered around like spectators at a bear baiting, eager for entertainment. I screamed before the tongs even touched me. When Gristle finally got hold of the tooth, he yanked and twisted with all the delicacy of a man uprooting a tree stump. There was a crunch, a pop, and then pain so intense I thought lightning had taken residence in my skull. Tooth problems were common as dirt aboard ship. All that hardtack and zero dental care meant pirates' mouths were rotting disasters. Cavities festered, gums swelled, infections spread like wildfire. I'd heard tales from other ships of something called jawworms, which sounded made up until you saw a man's face caved in from infection. The standard treatment was exactly what I received. Yank it out and pray. Anesthesia, if it existed at all, was usually just rum and someone sitting on your chest to keep you from thrashing. Some men died from shock or blood loss. I was fortunate. I only passed out and woke up with one less tooth and the taste of iron coating my throat. But that was just the appetizer course of suffering. The real feast of misery came a few days later when fever set in. I was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, soaked in sweat, and my jaw had swollen into a grotesque lump that made me look like a diseased chipmunk. The infection hadn't left. It had just gone deeper, creeping toward my brain and whispering sweet promises of delirium and death. Some said it was blood poisoning. Others claimed I was cursed. Nobody offered a cure. I lay in my hammock, mouth swollen shut, drooling like an infant, muttering incoherently to anyone who'd listen. Honestly, I was impressed I'd made it that far. But if the teeth didn't kill you, the limbs would. Pirate life was brutal on the body. Every day brought new opportunities for injury, pulling ropes that could snap and take your hand off, climbing rigging that swayed like a pendulum in a windstorm, lifting barrels that could crush your foot, swinging onto enemy decks during raids where anything and everything could go wrong. Injuries turned ugly fast in that environment. A twisted ankle meant you couldn't work properly. A splinter in the wrong place could fester into an abscess the size of a crab. And then there was the ultimate nightmare: amputation. Losing a finger or hand meant you were lucky. You could still function. Losing a leg earned you a nickname and a wooden replacement, assuming you survived the surgery. I got my first demonstration of pirate medicine 2 weeks after my tooth extraction. A cannon misfired during practice and turned a man's arm into something resembling bloody pasta. He didn't scream immediately, just stared at the mangled mess like it had personally betrayed him. Then the pain hit, and his screams could have awakened the dead. Gristle was summoned again. This time he brought his full kit: a roll of blood-stained cloth, a saw that reeked of decay, and a jug of rum strong enough to strip paint. The decision-making process was refreshingly simple. If the arm stayed, the man died. If it went, he might live. No second opinions, no consultations, no time for doubt. They strapped him down and Gristle went to work. The saw made wet, crunching sounds as it chewed through bone, and the screaming was so raw it seemed to echo in my spine. When it was over, Gristle casually tossed the severed limb overboard and wiped his hands on his pants like he'd just finished gutting a fish. The man survived. Barely. He woke up alternating between sobbing and laughing, and I couldn't decide which was more disturbing. Surgery at sea was a medieval affair at best. Pirate surgeons, when they existed at all, were usually failed doctors or ship's carpenters who figured, how different can a leg be from a mast? They cauterized wounds with hot tar and stitched people up with thread that had probably been mending sails the day before. Sterilization was a foreign concept. If you didn't die from the procedure, you still had to survive infection, fever, and the fact that you were recovering in a floating germ factory where rats chewed on your bandages at night. Historical accounts vary wildly on amputation survival rates among pirates. Some claim success rates were surprisingly high, given the primitive conditions. Others insist that any survival stories were exaggerated over time to build pirate mythology. Either way, going under Gristle's blade wasn't about science. It was about rolling the dice and hoping luck was feeling generous. I saw the aftermath firsthand. There was a man with a wooden peg leg who claimed he'd once been the fastest sailor on the 7 seas. Now he spent his days polishing his artificial limb with whale oil and telling anyone who'd listen about the time he kicked a man off a plank. With my good leg, mind you, he'd always add with a bitter laugh. He was one of the few who could joke about his loss. Others stayed quiet as if the sea had taken more than just flesh. It had claimed pieces of their souls as well. I started taking better care of myself after witnessing these horrors. I brushed my remaining teeth with a scrap of cloth soaked in rum. I prayed I'd never get so much as a splinter. I avoided Gristle like he was plague incarnate. Every morning I'd take inventory of my limbs like a merchant counting stock. Everything still attached? Good. Another day survived. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake listening to someone 3 hammocks over cough like they were drowning in their own lungs, and I'd think, this can't possibly get worse. But of course I was wrong again. Because pirates, it turned out, had rules. Lots of them. And breaking those rules could earn you punishments that made Gristle's medical procedures look like gentle massage therapy. But before I tell you about the code that governed our floating asylum, let me share something that might surprise you about the daily rhythm of life aboard a pirate ship. Because beyond the violence and medical horror, there was something else. A strange, twisted form of order that kept us all from simply murdering each other in our sleep. The ship ran on watches, you see. Day and night, someone was always awake, always alert, always ready to scream a warning or cut a throat. The night watch was particularly brutal, standing alone in the dark, staring into an abyss that stared back, listening for sounds that might mean salvation or doom. I remember my first night watch vividly. They posted me near the bow with a musket that might fire if I begged it nicely, and a lantern that swung with every wave, casting dancing shadows across the rigging. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, like I could reach out and touch it. My job was simple: watch for other ships and scream if I saw anything. Of course, if I did see something, it usually meant trouble. Navy ships, rival pirates, or merchant vessels that might fight back. None of these were particularly good news when you were just trying to survive another day. Sleep deprivation became a way of life. You doze in awkward intervals between shifts, waking up unsure what day it was or whether you were still alive. I started forgetting basic things. Words, names, where I'd left my knife. My hands would shake, my eyes would twitch, and sometimes I'd catch myself talking to the mast like it was an old friend. The sea played tricks on an exhausted mind. I'd see sails that weren't there, hear bells that never rang, and sometimes I'd swear I saw my childhood home floating just off the starboard side. Hallucinations weren't discussed openly, but they weren't uncommon either. A man might see mermaids with rotting faces or hear his dead mother calling his name across the waves. One fellow swore he'd kissed a mermaid once. He had no lips left, which might have been related or might have been a coincidence. Either way, I didn't ask for details. Historically, the combination of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, fear, and strong alcohol made hallucinations almost inevitable among pirates and sailors. Some accounts describe shared visions, entire crews seeing phantom ships or spectral lights. Whether these were mass hysteria or something else entirely is still debated by scholars who've never spent a night alone on a ship in hostile waters. The Night Watch taught you about the sea's personality, and yes, it had one. The ocean wasn't just water, it was a living thing with moods and appetites. Sometimes it would whisper against the hull like it was telling secrets. Other times it would slap the ship like an angry drunk looking for a fight. There were nights when I'd stare into those black waters and feel absolutely certain something was staring back. Elias, a fellow crew member who became my closest friend during those dark days, called it sea eyes, the feeling that the ocean was watching, deciding whether you were worth keeping or whether it was time to drag you down to whatever waited in the depths. Superstitions ruled the night watches. Bad omens could be anything: a red sunrise, a bird landing on the mast, or someone whistling in the dark. I learned these beliefs quickly because ignoring them could get you killed. Not by supernatural forces, but by a crew that believed you'd brought bad luck aboard. I once watched them shoot a black seabird that had perched on our bowsprit. "Bad luck," Whisper muttered, the only time I ever heard him speak. The bird exploded into feathers and blood, and for a moment everyone relaxed. Then a storm hit 6 hours later, and we spent the night convinced we'd been cursed for killing it. The line between reality and superstition blurred during those long dark hours. When you're alone with nothing but sea and stars, your brain starts filling in the blanks with whatever nightmares it can conjure. I began to understand why pirates believed in monsters, because something about the ocean felt alive, calculating and hungry. During my months at sea, I learned to read the ship's moods almost as well as the ocean's. She'd creak in different ways depending on the weather, the cargo, and the crew's state of mind. The timbers would groan with fatigue after a long chase, sigh with relief when we reached calm waters, and occasionally emit sounds that suggested she was in actual pain. Ships, the old salts claimed, had souls. They remembered every battle, every storm, every death that occurred on their decks. Sometimes, late at night, you could hear them mourning, a low, mournful sound that might have been wind in the rigging, or might have been something else entirely. I started talking to our ship during the lonely hours, not because I believed she could hear me, but because hearing my own voice reminded me I was still human. Sometimes, when the wind was right and the moon was dark, I could almost convince myself she talked back. The worst part about Night Watch wasn't the solitude or the supernatural dread. It was the knowledge that dawn would bring new horrors. Because pirates, despite their reputation for chaos, lived under a strict code of conduct, and that code was enforced with a creativity that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. I'd assumed pirates were lawless savages, wild, unhinged men who lived without rules or consequences. Some of them were exactly that, I'll grant you. But here's the twist that knocked me sideways. Pirate ships operated under more rules than a monastery. They called it the Code, and you'd better learn it fast, because ignorance wasn't an excuse when the punishment involved whips, knives, or a charming desert island where you could die of exposure while contemplating your mistakes. The code wasn't written on fine parchment or nailed to the mast for easy reference. It lived in the collective memory of the crew, passed down through gritted teeth and blood-stained whispers like a gospel of violence and survival. My first lesson came from the quartermaster, a scarred mountain of a man with a voice like grinding stone, and a nose that had clearly lost several arguments. He called the new recruits to the deck one morning and proceeded to educate us like a schoolmaster, who'd already accepted our inevitable failure. "Rule 1, he growled. "Equal shares. Every man gets his cut according to rank, but even the lowest swab gets something. No more of that paid-in-glory horseshit from your merchant days. Here, everyone bleeds for the prize, everyone gets a piece." This wasn't what I'd expected from a group of cutthroats, but pirates hated unfair captains more than they hated the Royal Navy. When they took a ship, everything got divided according to a system more organized than most legitimate businesses. Gold, food, weapons, supplies. It all went into the common pot and came out distributed by rank and contribution. "Rule 2, the quartermaster continued, maintain your gear. Weapons, clothes, anything the crew depends on. Lose your pistol in a raid, 10 lashes. Let your powder get wet, 20. Forget to clean your musket and you might find yourself swimming with the fish." The crew couldn't afford carelessness because every mistake cost lives and treasure. A misfiring weapon during battle could doom the entire ship. A rotted rope could bring down a mast in a storm. Personal responsibility wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with enthusiasm. Rule 3. Settle disputes properly. Fights happen, but they get resolved by duel or vote, depending on how much blood anyone's willing to spill. Once it's done, it's done. Carry a grudge longer than a few days and people start watching you. And watched people don't live long. The code continued from there, covering everything from lights-out protocols to gambling restrictions to the cardinal rule about romantic entanglements among the crew. That last one was enforced with particular vigour, and I suspected someone had learned the hard way that love triangles and gunpowder didn't mix well. Here's what surprised me most. These rules actually made sense. Pirate crews couldn't rely on law and order from shore, so they created their own. Unlike most naval vessels where officers ruled through fear and tradition, captains on pirate ships could be voted out if they lost the crew's confidence. It was rough democracy at the point of a sword, but democracy nonetheless. Historically, this wasn't fiction. Real pirate codes like those of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, were remarkably detailed, covering conduct, loot division, punishment protocols, and even what music could be played on deck. Some codes banned gambling entirely. Others required everyone to keep their weapons sharp at all times. The goal wasn't morality, it was survival. An undisciplined crew was a dead crew. But here's where things got complicated. Enforcement of the code depended entirely on the mood of the ship. One day, a man might drop his knife and receive a warning. The next, someone could forget to clean a cannon and end up lashed to the mast with his back resembling shredded sailcloth. Justice aboard a pirate ship was like a storm, random, violent, and full of things flying through the air. I witnessed this firsthand when a young man, barely 17, was caught pocketing a silver spoon after a raid. A spoon. The captain didn't hesitate. He ordered the boy tied up and whipped 12 times in front of the entire crew. The kid didn't cry, just gritted his teeth and endured while blood ran down his back like spilled wine. Afterward, they untied him and handed him a piece of cloth to bite on. "Don't do it again," someone said, like that profound wisdom would somehow heal the damage. I didn't sleep well that night. Punishments varied wildly in their creativity and severity. Lashing was common enough. It left permanent scars and sometimes killed, but it was considered merciful compared to the alternatives. Marooning was reserved for traitors and serious offenders. They'd drop you on a deserted island with a pistol and a single shot. Not enough to survive indefinitely, just enough to choose your own ending when starvation and madness became unbearable. Then there was keel hauling, A punishment so vicious I'd assumed it was just sailors' tall tales until I saw the preparations begin. They'd tie ropes around a man's chest and ankles, throw him into the water, and drag him under the ship's hull. The barnacles would strip skin like cheese. Water would fill his lungs, and if he surfaced at all, it was as a screaming, shredded version of his former self. Fortunately, keel hauling was rare. Even pirates considered it excessive, which should tell you something about how horrific it actually was. Some historians debate whether these punishments were as frequent as legend suggests. Keel hauling, for instance, might have been more of a naval tradition than a pirate one, and marooning, while well documented, may have been less common than stories claim. What's certain is that pirate crews enforced their codes with a combination of paranoia and brutality that kept everyone in line through sheer terror. One detail that fascinated me was the practice of articles tattoos. Some pirates had portions of the code inked onto their bodies, especially rules about fair shares and mutual obligations. It wasn't just decoration. If someone died in battle, their tattooed rules could help settle disputes over treasure, or at least give the crew something to read while looting the corpse. I never got any tattoos myself, but I started to understand their appeal. Having the rules literally carved into your skin meant you'd never forget them, and in a world where forgetting could get you killed, that seemed like reasonable insurance. The longer I lived under the code, the more it warped my sense of right and wrong. Morality became fluid. I stopped thinking in terms of good and evil and started calculating smart versus stupid. You did whatever kept you breathing and hoped your name never came up when punishment was being distributed. There was always someone planning to break the rules, of course. I heard whispers about a man considering jumping ship in the middle of the night, not during a raid or battle, just vanishing into the darkness when he thought nobody was watching. He was tired of the code, tired of the violence, tired of the constant fear. I never found out if he went through with it, but I spent several sleepless nights wondering what would happen if he did. Would they chase him down? Shoot him as he swam? Or worse, would they let him go and pretend he'd never existed? The uncertainty was almost worse than witnessing actual punishment, because it meant the rules were whatever the crew decided they were on any given day. Out there, freedom was just another word for following very specific guidelines or dying in very specific ways. And every morning brought new opportunities to test those boundaries, new ways to accidentally cross lines you didn't know existed until you were bleeding from the consequences. I woke to screaming, not panicked or terrified screaming, but the everyday variety of drunken argument that passed for morning conversation among pirates. Two men were debating whose turn it was to shovel filth out of the bilge, and their discussion had escalated to the level where personal insults regarding ancestry and hygiene were being traded like cannon fire. It was still dark, probably just before dawn, and the air below deck was thick with the familiar cocktail of sweat, stale grog, and the unmistakable sour tang of men who considered bathing a suspicious foreign practice. I rolled over in my hammock and nearly tumbled directly into a puddle of what I desperately hoped was spilled rum. Another day in paradise. Privacy on a pirate ship was not just rare, it was mythical. Everyone slept, ate, defecated, argued, and occasionally died in the same cramped space. The smell had achieved biblical proportions, clinging to everything like a malevolent spirit that couldn't be exorcised by any amount of salt water or prayer. You learned not to breathe through your nose, at least not deeply. That was a rookie mistake that led to gagging fits, and the kind of nausea that made you question every life choice that had brought you to this floating asylum. The smell was layered like sedimentary rock. unwashed bodies forming the foundation, overlaid with rotting food, stagnant bilge water, and something sweetly putrid that I never identified and never wanted to. My crewmates were a collection of misfits and psychopaths that would have been remarkable for their diversity if they hadn't all shared the common trait of being completely unhinged. There was Rat-Face Pete, who kept dead seagulls in a crate because he believed they brought good fortune. His proof was that he hadn't died yet, which I had to admit was compelling evidence by pirate standards. Then there was Crazy Jack, who maintained extensive conversations with his belt as if it were a trusted advisor. The belt apparently had strong opinions about navigation, weather patterns, and the moral character of various crew members. Jack took its counsel seriously, which worried me because the belt seemed to have a vindictive streak. Old Broady had pulled out his own tooth with a fishing hook during a particularly boring watch, and now wore it on a string around his neck like some kind of dental trophy. He claimed it gave him good luck in fights, though his missing ear and scarred face suggested his luck was distinctly limited. These weren't the romantic rogues of popular stories. They didn't sing sea shanties in perfect harmony, or engage in witty banter while swashing their buckles. They bickered constantly, coughed blood with alarming frequency, and argued over dice games whose rules seemed to change every 5 minutes. Many of them were criminals who'd been too awful even for life on land. Murderers, deserters, thieves who'd been kicked off other ships for being insufficiently trustworthy. And these were my co-workers, my bunkmates, the men I trusted to watch my back during battles and not stab me in it during peaceful moments. Conflict was as constant as the tides. Fights erupted over everything. Stolen rations, cheating at cards, someone snoring too loudly, philosophical differences about whether mermaids were real, and the eternal question of whose turn it was to clean up after other people's bodily functions. I learned to sleep with my boots on, and my knife within easy reach. Not because I was particularly brave, but because being prepared for violence was like carrying an umbrella in a storm. You might not need it, but when you did, you really needed it. One night I witnessed what passed for conflict resolution among pirates. 2 men got into a dispute over a missing knife. Instead of involving the quartermaster or trying to reason through the problem like civilized humans, they decided to settle matters with what they called gentle persuasion. This involved one man hitting the other with a wooden bucket until he confessed to theft, promised to return the knife, and agreed to let the bucket wielder have first choice of sleeping spots for the next week. The victim, nursing a broken nose and what appeared to be a mild concussion, seemed satisfied with this arrangement. Historically, pirate crews were melting pots of humanity's worst impulses. You'd find ex-Navy men, escaped slaves, failed farmers, and thieves from every continent. Ships like Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge were floating towers of Babel, with crew members speaking a dozen different languages and communicating mostly through shared profanity and violent gestures. Yet somehow, despite the chaos and constant potential for mayhem, these crews functioned. They sailed ships, conducted raids, and managed complex operations that required coordination, timing, and mutual trust. It wasn't order in any traditional sense. It was organized chaos held together by shared desperation and the knowledge that individual survival depended on group success. The rhythm of shipboard life developed its own strange logic. You'd wake to arguments, spend the day working alongside the same people who'd been threatening to gut each other at breakfast, share meals with men who'd steal your last biscuit without hesitation, and fall asleep listening to the same voices that had been promising violence and death 12 hours earlier. There was an understanding, never spoken but always present, that personal disputes were luxury items that the crew couldn't afford. You might hate the man working beside you, but you needed him functional when storms hit or enemy ships appeared. Killing each other was acceptable only during designated times and approved circumstances. The social hierarchy was fluid and brutal. Respect was earned through competence, cruelty, or sheer intimidating presence. A man could be the ship's fool one day and its unofficial leader the next, depending on how he handled himself during a crisis. Some pirates actually preferred this life to anything they'd known on land. The traditional rules didn't apply here. Your birth circumstances, family name, or previous occupation meant nothing. If you could sail, fight, and avoid getting killed, you earned your place regardless of whether you'd been born a lord or a beggar. There were even cases of escaped slaves rising to positions of leadership on pirate ships, something unthinkable in legitimate society. The sea was an equal opportunity destroyer of conventional social boundaries, but the psychological toll was enormous. Living in constant proximity to violence, surrounded by people who might betray or murder you for insufficient reasons, created a special kind of stress that wore men down from the inside. I watched strong men develop nervous tics, start talking to themselves, or simply shut down emotionally as a defense mechanism. Some turned to religion with the fervor of the recently converted. Others embraced the chaos so completely they became indistinguishable from the madness around them. The line between sanity and survival was often razor thin. You had to be crazy enough to function in this environment, but sane enough to recognize when the craziness was becoming permanent. Too much sanity made you weak and vulnerable. Too much madness made you dangerous to everyone, including yourself. Sleep was always precarious, not just because of the physical discomfort, but because of the psychological pressure. You'd lie in your hammock, listening to the sounds of dozens of men breathing, snoring, muttering, and occasionally screaming in their dreams. Sometimes you'd hear whispered conversations about plans that probably involved theft, betrayal, or violence. Everyone developed their own methods of coping with the stress. Some men carved elaborate designs into pieces of wood, creating intricate sculptures that served no purpose beyond occupying their minds. Others collected seemingly worthless items, buttons, strange shells, scraps of colourful cloth, arranging them into patterns that made sense only to their creators. Prayer was common, though usually directed toward gods who'd already demonstrated their indifference to pirates' welfare. I heard men bargaining with divine powers, promising reform and repentance in exchange for survival through the sex storm or battle. The most successful coping mechanism was probably the gradual hardening of conscience that allowed you to commit acts of violence and theft without being destroyed by guilt. You learned to think of victims as abstract concepts rather than individual human beings with families, dreams, and fears. This psychological armor was necessary for survival, but it came with a price. Each act of violence, each moment of cruelty, each time you chose survival over morality, you lost a piece of whatever humanity you'd started with. Some men lost so much they forgot they'd ever been anything other than predators. The ship itself became a character in this drama, creaking and groaning with its own personality and moods. She responded differently to various weather conditions, seemed to favour certain crew members over others, and occasionally made sounds that suggested she had opinions about how she was being handled. Sailors are naturally superstitious, but pirates took it to extremes. Everything was an omen. The direction birds flew, the colour of sunset, the pattern of foam on waves. A black cat seen on shore meant good luck, A black cat seen aboard ship meant disaster. A woman aboard brought bad weather unless she was there voluntarily, in which case she brought good fortune, but only if she stayed happy. These beliefs weren't just quaint folklore, they were survival mechanisms in a world where random death was always possible, and finding patterns in chaos helped maintain the illusion of control. The most persistent superstition involved the sea itself, which every pirate knew was alive, conscious, and hungry. It had moods, preferences, and an infinite memory for slights. Men who'd wronged the sea would eventually pay the price, though the bill might not come due for years. This anthropomorphic view of the ocean wasn't just poetic fancy. It was practical psychology. If the sea was alive, you could potentially bargain with it, please it, avoid its wrath through proper behavior. If it was just water and weather, you were completely helpless, which was too terrifying to contemplate for extended periods. The most successful pirates learned to read the sea's moods, to sense when it was angry or playful or murderously indifferent. They developed an intuitive understanding of wind patterns, wave formations, and the subtle signs that preceded storms. This knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, sailor to sailor, generation to generation. No formal education could teach you when the watercolour meant shark feeding time, or which cloud formations preceded 3 days of deadly calm, but even the most experienced seamen could be surprised by the ocean's sudden changes of mood. The sea that had been your ally for months could turn enemy without warning, and the same waters that had carried you safely through a dozen battles could suddenly decide it was time to collect your debt. Living with this constant uncertainty required a special kind of mental flexibility. You had to plan for the future while accepting that the future might not include you. You had to form attachments to people while knowing they could disappear at any moment. You had to maintain hope while acknowledging that hope was probably misplaced. The successful pirates were those who found the balance between caring and not caring, between engagement and detachment. They invested enough in their shipmates to function as a crew, but held back enough emotional reserve to survive the inevitable losses. It was a delicate psychological dance, and many men never mastered it. They either became too attached and were destroyed by grief when friends died, or they became so detached they lost the human connections that made survival worthwhile. I was still learning this balance when fate decided to test my progress in the most brutal way possible. You'd think after months of violence, starvation, and psychological warfare, I would have developed some immunity to horror. You'd be wrong. Because nothing prepares you for the moment when you realize that everything you thought you knew about evil was just the opening chapter in a much longer, much darker book. It started with treasure. Real treasure this time, not the usual cargo of sugar and tobacco that we'd been risking our lives to steal. Word had reached our ears about a Spanish galleon heavy with silver from the New World colonies, sailing a predictable route through waters where pirates could intercept her with reasonable chances of success. The crew's excitement was infectious and terrifying. These men, who normally needed threats or bribes to perform basic ship maintenance, suddenly worked with the enthusiasm of believers who'd caught a glimpse of paradise. They sharpened weapons with religious fervour, mended sails with unprecedented care, and actually volunteered for extra watch duties. Treasure did things to pirates' minds that rum and violence couldn't achieve. It unified them in ways that ordinary greed never managed, creating a shared purpose that transcended individual survival instincts. For a brief moment, we weren't just a collection of desperate criminals trying not to die. We were a crew with a common goal and infinite possibilities dancing in our imaginations. The galleon was exactly where our intelligence had promised she'd be. wallowing through heavy seas like a pregnant whale laden with enough silver to make us all rich beyond the dreams of ordinary thieves. Her escort of 2 smaller vessels was formidable, but not insurmountable, especially if we could separate her from her protectors. Our captain demonstrated why he'd survived long enough to command a crew by executing a strategy that was both brilliant and completely insane. We approached flying Spanish colours, pretending to be merchant vessels seeking shelter from the storm that was building on the horizon. The deception worked long enough for us to get within cannon range before raising our true flag and opening fire. The battle that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. The Spanish fought with the desperate courage of men protecting something precious, while we attacked with the focused savagery of predators who'd smelled blood. Cannon fire thundered across the water, turning the sea into a cauldron of smoke, spray, and splintered wood. When we finally boarded the galleon, what we found in her hold exceeded even our most optimistic fantasies. Chests of silver coins, religious artifacts encrusted with precious stones, gold ingots stamped with Spanish royal seals, and jewellery that represented the accumulated wealth of entire civilizations. But treasure, as I was about to learn, carries its own curse. The sight of so much wealth did something to the crew's collective sanity. Men who'd been willing to share hardtack and rum suddenly became obsessive about their individual portions of the haul. Friendships that had survived storms and battles dissolved over arguments about who deserved larger shares. The division process, normally handled with rough but functional fairness, became a nightmare of accusations, threats, and barely contained violence. Every coin was counted multiple times, every piece of jewellery examined for hidden value, every decision questioned by men who suddenly believed they were entitled to more than their agreed-upon portions. Worse yet, the treasure attracted attention from sources we hadn't anticipated. Other pirate crews, hearing rumours of our success, began shadowing our movements like sharks following a wounded whale. Navy patrols intensified their searches, knowing that ships heavy with stolen Spanish gold were prime targets for recapture, and the rewards that came with delivering pirates to justice. Most disturbing of all was what the wealth did to individual crew members. Some became paranoid, convinced that others were plotting to steal their shares. They started sleeping with loaded pistols and checking their personal belongings obsessively, as if their fellow pirates had suddenly become less trustworthy than before. Others developed a kind of manic euphoria, spending their portions in fits of celebratory excess that left them poorer than they'd been before the raid. They'd trade gold for bottles of exceptional rum, purchase elaborate clothes that served no practical purpose aboard ship, or gamble away fortunes on card games whose outcomes were obviously rigged. The treasure that was supposed to liberate us instead created new forms of slavery. Men became slaves to their greed, their paranoia, their newfound status as wealthy criminals. The coins in their pockets weighed them down more effectively than iron chains. Historical accounts of treasure divisions among pirate crews suggest that large hauls often caused more problems than they solved. Crews that had functioned smoothly while poor often disintegrated when faced with significant wealth. The promise of easy riches attracted the wrong kind of attention and created internal tensions that couldn't be resolved through traditional pirate democracy. Some of the most successful pirate captains actually avoided massive scores, preferring steady streams of smaller prizes that kept their crews motivated without driving them insane. They understood that poverty was preferable to the kind of wealth that destroyed men's souls, but we learned these lessons too late after the damage had already been done. The paranoia reached its peak when we discovered that someone had been systematically stealing from the common treasure. Small amounts at first, a few coins here, a minor piece of jewellery there, but enough to suggest that one of our own was violating the most sacred rule of pirate brotherhood. The investigation that followed revealed the ugly truth about human nature when large amounts of money are involved. Accusations flew like cannonballs, friendships were destroyed by suspicion, and the crew split into factions based more on personal loyalty than evidence or logic. When we finally identified the thief, a man who'd been with the crew for years and was trusted by everyone, the punishment was swift and brutal. But the damage to morale was permanent. If someone that trusted could betray the crew, how could anyone be certain about anyone else's loyalty? The psychological impact of betrayal was worse than any physical wound. It infected every interaction, every conversation, every shared meal, with the possibility that the person sitting next to you was already planning your destruction. The treasure that was supposed to represent freedom became a prison built from suspicion and fear. Meanwhile, the external threats continued to multiply. Navy ships appeared with increasing frequency, their crews motivated by the substantial bounties offered for our capture. Other pirates, hearing exaggerated accounts of our treasure, began treating us as targets rather than colleagues. We were forced to fight battles on multiple fronts, spending our hard-won wealth on additional weapons, ammunition, and supplies needed to defend ourselves against enemies we'd created through our own success. The treasure became a burden that we carried at enormous cost, both financial and human. The final irony came when we were forced to bury portions of our hoard on a remote island, not because we wanted to create the kind of treasure map that appears in adventure stories, but because carrying so much wealth made us too attractive to every predator in the Caribbean. The process of concealment was itself a source of conflict. Who could be trusted to know the location? How would the treasure be divided if only some crew members survived to return for it? What happened if the man who remembered the landmarks was killed before he could share the information? These questions had no satisfactory answers, which meant that even our solutions created new problems. We buried the treasure in multiple locations, with different groups knowing different parts of the total picture. This distributed the risk, but also ensured that recovering the wealth would require cooperation from people who no longer trusted each other. The whole experience taught me that treasure wasn't freedom. It was responsibility, danger, and corruption wrapped in shiny metal and sparkling stones. The men who dreamed of retiring to comfortable lives in exotic locations usually ended up dead in gutters, killed by other criminals who coveted their wealth, or by authorities who wanted the rewards for their capture. Those who survived long enough to spend their portions often discovered that money couldn't purchase the things they actually needed: safety, friendship, peace of mind, or a place in respectable society. Former pirates were marked men regardless of their financial status, forever looking over their shoulders for enemies both old and new. The smart ones learned to live modestly, hiding their wealth and avoiding the kind of conspicuous consumption that attracted unwanted attention. But even they paid a price, spending their remaining years isolated from normal human society, unable to form genuine relationships because they could never be completely honest about their past. Some historians argue that buried pirate treasure was more common than others believe, not because pirates were planning for retirement, but because they often had no choice except to hide wealth they couldn't safely carry or spend. The famous treasure maps were less romantic adventure stories and more practical necessities for criminals who'd stolen more than they could handle. But whether the treasure was buried, spent, or stolen by rivals, the outcome was usually the same: The pirates who'd risk everything to acquire it ended up no better off than when they'd started, and usually considerably worse. The dreams of easy wealth that had motivated so many men to choose piracy were revealed as cruel illusions. The sea gave nothing for free, and the price of everything was always higher than anyone wanted to pay. Yet despite knowing all this, despite seeing the evidence with my own eyes, and living through the consequences personally, I still felt the lure of potential treasure every time we spotted a promising sail on the horizon. The curse of gold wasn't just that it corrupted those who possessed it, it also infected those who merely dreamed of possessing it. That insidious hunger for easy wealth was perhaps the most dangerous enemy any pirate faced, because it was the one enemy that lived inside your own heart and whispered seductive lies during quiet moments when you thought you'd learned better. The treasure we'd worked so hard to steal ultimately taught us the most valuable lesson of pirate life. The real prize wasn't gold or silver or precious stones. It was simply staying alive long enough to realize that you'd been chasing the wrong things all along. But by then, for most of us, it was far too late to choose a different path. Someone was screaming about mutiny. The word passed through the crew like plague, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with growing confidence. I dragged myself from my hammock, every bone aching from the previous day's labour, and followed the crowd to see what fresh hell awaited us. Mutiny, as I was learning, was the inevitable result of pirates thinking too much. When men got hungry, or believed the loot was being unfairly distributed, or simply grew tired of taking orders from someone they could probably beat in a fair fight, knives started coming out. Not for enemies this time, but for each other. Our captain, a man called Boone, who was built like a fortress and had a voice that could summon storms, had led successful raids for months. But success apparently bred its own problems. Word was spreading that he'd skimmed treasure from the last haul, kept a few extra coins for himself, maybe hoarded a barrel of rum that nobody had noticed missing. Whether it was true didn't matter. Once the accusation took root, it spread like fire in dry wood. Pirates don't forgive theft, especially not from their own leaders. The quartermaster, Grim Harrow, wasn't helping matters. He was supposed to be the crew's voice, the man who kept the captain honest and the men satisfied. Instead, he'd been acting suspicious, whispering in corners, avoiding direct questions about the treasure division. Mutinies weren't rare in pirate life, despite what romantic stories might suggest. Pirate ships operated on a delicate balance of violent democracy. If the captain lost the crew's confidence, he could be voted out, marooned, or simply thrown overboard. Sometimes they'd maroon him on the nearest island with a bottle of water and a single bullet for when things got too desperate. I didn't want to choose sides, partly from cowardice and partly from sheer exhaustion. But staying neutral on a ship full of armed men with anger management issues was like swimming with sharks and hoping they'd respect your pacifist principles. So I listened, watched, and nodded at the right moments while keeping my opinions to myself. One night I found myself summoned to a secret meeting in the cargo hold. About 15 men had gathered near the powder room, which seemed like poor planning if anyone's temper got too explosive. A man named Crimp did most of the talking, claiming the captain had lost his edge, and it was time for new leadership. The next ship we take could be ours, he said, eyes gleaming in the lantern light. If we just back the right crew. Everyone looked at me expectantly. I nodded and lied through my teeth, agreeing to support whatever they were planning because disagreeing would have gotten me a knife between the ribs. The mood aboard ship changed immediately. Suddenly everyone moved faster, gripped their weapons tighter, and watched each other with the intensity of cats stalking mice. Captain Boone sensed the shift, they always do, and his eyes took on the hard glitter of a man calculating how many threats he could eliminate before they eliminated him. But instead of striking first with blood and fury, Boone did something unexpected. He called a crew meeting. The entire ship gathered on deck under a blazing sun, tension thick enough to cut with a cutlass. Boone stepped up to the helm and spoke without raising his voice or making threats. He acknowledged his mistakes. Yes, he'd taken more than his share, but from poor judgment rather than greed. He reminded the crew of their victories, the treasure in the hold, the Navy ships they'd outrun. Most surprisingly, he promised a fair vote. No bloodshed, no retribution, just democracy at its most basic level. We voted using scraps of cloth dropped into a barrel. Black for keeping Boone, red for replacing him. I chose black, not because I liked him particularly, but because I trusted Crimp even less. When the votes were counted, Boone won by the narrowest margin possible. Grim Harrow smirked like he'd known the outcome all along. Crimp said nothing, just nodded and walked away. The next morning, Crimp was gone. Vanished. No note, no witnesses, no splash in the night. Just empty space where a mutinous pirate used to be. Some claimed he'd jumped ship. Others suggested Boone had arranged a more permanent solution to the problem. Nobody discussed it openly, but the message was clear. Democracy was fine, but there were limits to what the captain would tolerate. Life returned to its normal rhythm of violence and routine, but with a new edge of wariness. Every smile seemed calculated, every laugh had teeth in it. The crew was quieter, more watchful. The code still governed our lives, but we'd all seen how quickly it could be bent or broken when survival was at stake. There's an old pirate superstition about sleeping near the ship's ladder. They say you should avoid it because you don't want to be the first one grabbed if someone needs a scapegoat in the middle of the night. After the almost mutiny, I moved my hammock to the far corner of the crew quarters, just in case. Scholars still debate how often pirate captains were actually deposed. Some argue it was rare. Most captains were too feared or respected to be challenged. Others point to documented cases like Charles Vane, who was ousted for being reckless, or Edward England, who was voted out for being too merciful to prisoners. The truth probably depended on the crew's mood, the size of the recent hauls, and which way the wind was blowing on any given Tuesday. What I learned was that the scariest enemy on a pirate ship wasn't the navy or a storm. It was the man standing next to you, smiling while he calculated how many steps it would take to throw you overboard. From that day forward, every dawn brought new suspicions, new alliances, new reasons to sleep with one eye open and both hands on your weapons. Because in a world where democracy was enforced at knife point, you were only as safe as your last vote. And there were always more votes coming. But before I could worry too much about internal politics, external threats had a way of focusing everyone's attention. Because nothing unites a fractious pirate crew quite like the prospect of violent death at the hands of the Royal Navy. It happened on a Tuesday. My luck with Tuesdays had clearly run out permanently. I was scrubbing the deck, thinking about absolutely nothing beyond getting the bloodstains out of the planking, when our lookout's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. Navy ship to windward. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Suddenly every man moved with purpose, hauling ropes and adjusting sails like their lives depended on it, which of course they did. I could see the enemy vessel now, cutting through the waves with the lethal grace of a predator that had spotted its prey. She was bigger than us, taller, heavier, and bristling with more guns than I could count. Her white sails snapped in the wind like banners of righteous fury, and I could practically feel the polished brass fittings and military discipline radiating from her deck. This wasn't just another merchant vessel to be robbed. This was death itself, dressed in naval uniform and flying the king's colours. Captain Boone bellowed for speed, and the crew responded like men possessed. I found myself hauling on lines until my hands bled, scrambling up rigging that swayed like a tree in a hurricane, all while trying not to look back at the ship that was gaining on us with every heartbeat. Cannon fire erupted across the water, a sound that grabbed you by the chest and shook you until your teeth rattled. Their first shot sent up a geyser of spray just off our port bow, close enough to drench us in seawater and terror. The second shot splintered our stern rail and sent wooden shrapnel flying like angry wasps. Our captain tried every trick he knew: sudden turns, false retreats, surprise manoeuvres that had worked against merchant vessels and incompetent privateers. But the Navy ship matched us move for move, answering every clever tactic with disciplined gun crews and superior firepower. When they closed to grappling range, the real nightmare began. Naval combat in the age of piracy was nothing like the elegant sword fights you see in theatrical productions. There were no witty exchanges of dialogue, no graceful parries and ripostes. It was screaming chaos, a tangle of bodies, steel, smoke, and blood that lasted either forever or 5 minutes, depending on how your mind processed terror. The enemy swarmed across onto our deck like a plague of uniformed locusts, sabres flashing, pistols cracking, voices raised in battle cries that probably sounded heroic to them and like the screaming of demons to us. I found myself locked in combat with a man twice my size who fought with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. I only survived because he slipped on a loose board and I managed to put my blade through his ribs while he was off balance. It wasn't skill or courage, it was pure, stupid luck and a willingness to stab first and feel guilty later. Around me, the deck had become a slaughterhouse. Men fell screaming, some from wounds, others into the churning water between the ships. I saw Elias fighting near the forecastle, his face twisted with desperate concentration, his shirt already soaked with blood that might or might not have been his own. The tide of battle turned when someone, I never found out who, managed to set fire to the enemy's mizzen sail. Flames leaped up the rigging like climbing demons, and suddenly the Navy crew was fighting two enemies, us and their own burning ship. Their captain made the wise decision to retreat while they still could, cutting the grappling lines and letting the wind carry them away from our blood-soaked deck. We watched them limp toward the horizon, trailing smoke and probably reconsidering their career choices. Our victory celebration was muted by the casualties. We'd lost 4 men outright, with 2 more dying slowly from wounds that would fester and kill them within days. The deck looked like a butcher's table, and everyone who'd survived bore fresh scars, some visible, others carved deeper into the soul. I sat against the mast afterward, hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold a cup steady, blood on my clothes and the taste of gunpowder coating my mouth like ash. Elias collapsed beside me, a crude bandage wrapped around his arm, and neither of us spoke for a long time. Historically, pirates avoided Navy confrontations whenever possible. They were outgunned, outmanned, and usually outsailed by professional warships. When they did fight, it was typically because they'd been cornered or surprised. Success against naval forces required speed, cunning, and enormous amounts of luck, commodities that weren't always available when you needed them most. But surviving one Navy encounter didn't make us heroes, it just made us targets. Because the Navy never forgot, and they never forgave. Word would spread through official channels, descriptions would be circulated, bounties would be posted. We were marked men now, and every port we approached might harbour enemies wearing official uniforms and carrying legal authority to hang us. That night, as I lay in my hammock listening to the ship's timbers creak and the wounded men moan in their sleep, I realised something had changed inside me. The boy who'd been pressed into piracy against his will was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more willing to do terrible things to stay alive. I wasn't sure if that was evolution or corruption, but it was certainly survival. The storms came without warning, as they always did. One moment we were sailing through relatively calm seas, under a sky that looked merely threatening rather than apocalyptic. The next, we were trapped in nature's own version of hell, fighting for our lives against wind and water that seemed personally offended by our existence. It started with a low groan from the rigging, the ship's way of announcing that something unpleasant was approaching. The ocean took on a different rhythm, no longer the steady roll we'd grown accustomed to, but something choppier, more aggressive, like a beast preparing to pounce. Then the rain began. Not gentle droplets or even a heavy shower, but a vertical river that fell in sheets so dense you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. With the rain came wind that howled like all the souls we'd sent to early graves, tearing at the sails and rigging with supernatural fury. Orders were shouted that nobody could hear over the din. Men scrambled up swaying masts to secure canvas before it ripped away completely, clinging to ropes that whipped like angry snakes. I found myself hauling on lines with hands that bled from the coarse hemp, my boots sliding on decks made treacherous by constant spray. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white fire illuminating the chaos in stark detail. Crew members soaked to the bone, faces twisted with effort and fear, the ship herself bucking like a wild horse trying to throw its riders into the abyss. Thunder followed each flash, so close and loud it seemed to be exploding inside our skulls. The waves grew monstrous, towering walls of black water that lifted us high enough to see empty horizon in every direction, then dropped us into valleys so deep it felt like we were falling into the earth's core. Every impact shook the ship to her bones, sending everything loose, flying through the air like deadly projectiles. Somewhere in the middle of the storm we lost a man, not to enemy action or disease, but to the sea's simple hunger. One moment he was there, struggling with a sail that had torn loose. The next, a wave larger than houses swept across the deck and he was gone. No scream, no splash we could hear over the wind, just absence where a human being had been. The storm lasted either minutes or hours. Time becomes meaningless when you're convinced each second might be your last. Water poured below deck faster than we could pump it out, turning our living space into a partially submerged nightmare. Barrels floated like coffins. Cargo shifted and crashed with every roll, and the bilge overflowed with a mixture of seawater and human misery. When the wind finally began to ease and the waves settled from mountainous to merely miserable, we surveyed the damage with the stunned silence of survivors. Sails hung in tatters, 2 masts showed stress fractures, and the deck was scattered with debris that had once been essential equipment. We'd survived, but barely. The ship herself seemed shocked by her own endurance, creaking and groaning like an old woman getting out of bed after a particularly brutal beating. Storms were the great equalizer at sea. They didn't care if you were navy or pirate, merchant or slave trader. Weather had its own agenda, and that agenda usually involved reminding humans how small and insignificant they were in the grand scheme of ocean and sky. Historically, more ships were lost to storms than to combat during the golden age of piracy. Hurricane seasons in the Caribbean were particularly deadly, with sudden tempests that could destroy entire fleets without warning. Pirates learned to read weather signs like scripture, because missing the warnings usually meant becoming another unmarked grave beneath the waves. The psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical damage. After surviving a major storm, crews often developed a 1,000-yard stare, a shell-shocked expression that suggested they'd seen too far into the abyss and hadn't liked what looked back. But there was no time for recovery or contemplation. Repairs needed to be made, sails patched, rigging secured. The sea didn't pause its threats just because you'd survived the last one. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new tests of whether you deserved to keep breathing, or if it was time to join the countless bones scattered across the ocean floor. That night, exhausted beyond measure and still tasting salt spray, I realized something profound about pirate life. It wasn't the violence or the lawlessness that broke men. It was the constant grinding awareness that you existed entirely at the mercy of forces vastly more powerful than yourself. The sea owned you, body and soul, and it could collect its debt whenever it pleased. But even storms and naval battles paled in comparison to the slow poison of betrayal that eventually infected our crew. Because when you live in close quarters with desperate men carrying deadly weapons, trust becomes the most precious and fragile commodity aboard ship. It started with small things, supplies going missing, whispered conversations that stopped when you approached, glances that lingered too long and carried too much calculation. Someone was talking to the wrong people, passing information that had no business leaving the ship. We discovered the extent of our problem when a navy trap closed around us like the jaws of a mechanical beast. They caught us while we slept, boarding silently in the pre-dawn darkness and surrounding us before we could mount any resistance. I woke to find a sword point hovering near my throat, held by a clean-shaven officer whose uniform was so pristine it seemed to mock our ragged, salt-stained existence. Behind him, more soldiers swarmed the ship with the efficiency of men who knew exactly where to find what they were looking for. The capture was humiliatingly thorough. No dramatic last stands, no defiant speeches, just the methodical processing of criminals by representatives of His Majesty's justice. We were bound, catalogued, and loaded into a Navy transport vessel that reeked of authority and righteousness. The trial that followed was more theatre than jurisprudence. They had their evidence, their witnesses, their predetermined outcomes. We were paraded before magistrates who'd already written our death sentences, asked to confess crimes we may or may not have committed, and given opportunities to implicate others in exchange for the slim possibility of mercy. I chose defiance over cooperation, mainly because I had nothing useful to offer, and cooperation rarely saved pirates from the gallows anyway. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at Port Royal as an example to other would-be criminals. Port Royal had once been a pirate haven, a place where stolen goods were fenced and no questions were asked about the provenance of your wealth. Now it served as the Crown's gleaming example of reformed civilization, complete with gallows specifically designed for the public execution of pirates. The irony wasn't lost on me as they marched us through streets that had once welcomed men like us with open arms and flowing rum. Times change, politics shift, and yesterday's heroes become tomorrow's criminals with disturbing regularity. The night before our scheduled execution, I sat in a stone cell that smelled like despair and listened to other condemned men pray, curse, or simply weep for the lives they'd never get to finish. Elias, in the cell next to mine, asked if I thought it had been worth it. All the violence, the freedom, the treasure, the terror. I told him no, because at that moment, facing death at dawn, I couldn't see any glory in what we'd become. We were just thieves and murderers who'd run out of luck and time. But sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humour and an appreciation for dramatic timing. The rescue came as a form of an explosion that shook the gallows platform like an earthquake and filled the air with smoke thick enough to hide an army. In the chaos that followed, shouts, gunfire, people running in every direction, familiar hands cut our bonds and dragged us through confusion that was either masterfully planned or incredibly fortunate. I never learned exactly who orchestrated our escape. Some said it was Maud and her crew, the same pirate captain we'd once shared loot with. Others claimed it was local smugglers paid to create a distraction. One drunk in a tavern weeks later swore the devil himself had risen from hell to tear down the gallows. What mattered was that we were free again, running through back alleys with stolen clothes and borrowed time, making our way to a leaky boat that would carry us back to the only life we knew. The escape felt less like liberation and more like postponement. We'd cheated death this time, but the noose would be waiting for us somewhere else, some other day. Pirates rarely died in bed surrounded by loving families. We died by violence, disease, or the executioner's rope, usually before we'd lived long enough to regret our choices properly, but freedom, even temporary freedom, tasted sweeter than anything I'd ever experienced. Salt air, open water, the possibility of another sunrise. These became precious beyond gold or jewels. Maud's ship found us drifting in that pathetic excuse for a boat, more dead than alive but still technically breathing. She hauled us aboard with the casual efficiency of someone who'd rescued drowning pirates before, fed us, let us recover, and eventually offered us positions in her crew. Her ship was different from the chaos I'd grown accustomed to. Cleaner, better organised, more disciplined without being oppressive. Maud ran her crew with firm fairness, preferring profits to pointless violence and strategy to random brutality. For a while I thought I'd found something approaching a sustainable life. We raided carefully chosen targets, avoided unnecessary confrontations, and operated more like a business than a floating asylum. Elias became the ship's unofficial quartermaster, managing supplies and morale with equal skill. But even the best pirate stories don't have happy endings, just different varieties of conclusion. The raid that changed everything seemed routine at first. A Spanish treasure ship heavily loaded but poorly guarded. The kind of prize that pirates dream about and rarely encounter. The attack went smoothly until we discovered the ship was defended not by regular sailors but by professional mercenaries, hard men with cold eyes and no fear of death. The fighting was brutal even by pirate standards. These weren't merchants desperate to protect their cargo. They were killers who took pride in their work and had been paid well to demonstrate their skills. I took down one of them by tackling him into the hold and fighting among gunpowder barrels and broken crates, rolling through debris while trying to drive my blade into something vital before he did the same to me. I don't remember the killing blow, just blood, screaming, and then sudden silence. When the battle ended, we'd won the treasure but lost 4 good men, including Elias. He'd been shot through the gut while covering my retreat, a wound that meant slow death and terrible pain with no hope of recovery. I dragged him to the deck, screaming for help that couldn't save him, watching the light fade from eyes that had seen too much violence and not enough peace. His last words were, "You still owe me for that orange," a reference to a piece of fruit I'd bought him months earlier during shore leave. Then he was gone, and something inside me went with him. We buried him at sea with the others, weighted bodies sliding into water that had already claimed so many lives it must have been more bone than salt by then. Maud said appropriate words about courage and sacrifice, but all I could think about was how pointless it all seemed. What was the purpose of accumulating treasure if the price was measured in friends' lives? What kind of freedom was worth the constant fear, the endless violence, the knowledge that every sunrise might be your last? That night I sat at the bow with Elias's pipe in my hands. It wouldn't light any more, but I kept it anyway as a memento of better times that now seemed like someone else's memories. There's an old belief that sailors who die at sea have their souls bound to the water forever, doomed to wander the depths until the ocean itself dies. Whether that's true or just another superstition born from too much rum and too little hope, I couldn't say. But sometimes, when the wind was right and the moon was dark, I swear I could hear Elias laughing at some private joke only he understood. I stayed with Maud's crew for another year, growing stronger and quieter, earning respect through competence rather than bravado. Eventually she offered me my own command, a sloop, a crew, a chance to write my own chapter in the endless book of piracy. I declined. Not from fear or laziness, but because I'd finally learned what freedom actually meant. It wasn't about being the captain of your own destiny, or following your dreams wherever they led. True freedom was having enough choices to pick the ones that didn't require you to kill or be killed on a regular basis. When we next made port at the island far from Navy patrols and wanted posters, I disembarked for the last time. Maud watched me go without question or judgment, just a nod that said she understood. Some storms you weather, others you abandon ship to survive. These days I live in a small hut near the water, fixing boats and telling stories to anyone brave enough to listen. I eat fruit that hasn't been stolen, sleep in a bed that doesn't rock with the waves, and count my remaining teeth like a miser counting coins. Sometimes people ask about the rope scar around my neck, the souvenir of my brief appointment with the hangman's noose. I usually tell them it's from when I tried to kiss a Navy girl. That gets a laugh and changes the subject quickly enough. At night I walk the beach and listen to the sea calling like an old lover who refuses to accept that the relationship is over. The water whispers promises of adventure, treasure, and freedom that I now know are lies dressed up in moonlight and salt spray. I don't answer those calls anymore. I've had my fill of the pirate's life, paid my dues in blood and terror and sleepless nights. The sea owns enough of my soul already. I'm keeping what's left for myself. So that's my story, friend. Not the romanticized tale of adventure and treasure that people want to hear, but the truth about what it really meant to sail under the black flag. It was brutal, terrifying, and ultimately pointless. A lifestyle that consumed good men and spat out broken survivors who spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd seen and done. If you're looking for glory in these words, you won't find it. If you want lessons about honor among thieves or the romance of life outside the law, look elsewhere. What I can offer is this. Sometimes survival is victory enough, and sometimes the best treasure is simply being alive to count it. The sea is still out there, still calling to young men who think they want adventure more than they want safety. Maybe some of them will read this story and reconsider. Maybe others will ignore every warning and seek their own fortunes among the waves. Either way, they'll learn what I learned. The ocean gives nothing for free, and the price of everything is always higher than you think you can afford. But you pay it anyway, because once you've tasted that particular brand of freedom, Nothing else ever quite satisfies the hunger it leaves behind. Now pour yourself another drink, friend, and be grateful for your soft bed and solid ground. Because out there in the darkness, the sea is still hungry, and it's always looking for new souls to add to its collection.